Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I never asked for this. Sometimes, I wonder what would happen if I just told someone what I've been feeling. Maybe they'd laugh. Maybe they'd think I was losing my mind. But no one would understand. Not really. I can feel it now, the weight of eyes on me, though no one is here. Just me, sitting at my desk, staring at the words I'm typing, but feeling something else in the room, something unseen. It all started subtly enough. At first, I thought I was just overthinking things. A door creaking when there was no one near it. A faint whisper on the wind when the room was perfectly still. Little things. Insignificant things. But then, it began to get harder to ignore. The first time it really hit me was when I walked into the living room and saw my reflection in the window. It was odd, the way the glass seemed to blur, almost as if someone else were standing behind me. But when I turned, the room was empty. Nothing but the dim glow of the streetlights outside. I didn't think much of it. Not at first. But it kept happening. In the corner of my eye, the feeling of someone being there, just out of reach, always a few steps behind. At night, I couldn't sleep without hearing the faintest tapping on the walls. A small sound, like a knock, but not a knock, a reminder that something else was watching, listening. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But the more I tried, the worse it got. The tapping grew louder. And then, one day, my phone buzzed with a message I didn't remember receiving. I opened it, expecting something innocuous, maybe a reminder, a text from a friend. But it was a picture. A picture of me, sitting at my desk, the one where I was just now typing these words. I froze, the air thick with something that wasn't quite fear, but close. My heart pounded in my chest. The message was simple, I see you. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe someone had taken the picture through my window. Maybe it was a coincidence. But no one had been outside. No one had seen me. No one except for that. That's when I started noticing it everywhere. The subtle shifts, the way people's faces looked just a little too familiar, as though they had been watching me for longer than I realized. The small, almost unnoticeable shifts in their behavior. A glance that lasted too long. A smile that felt like it held some kind of secret. It wasn't just the people around me. It was the places too. The way the light would change in certain rooms, the shadows growing just a little too long. I'd turn around, and suddenly, the hallway felt different, colder, darker. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things. I didn't want to believe it. But every time I thought I was safe, I'd feel that pressure again. The sensation of being watched, studied, judged, as if something was pulling the strings of my life, manipulating my every move. Was it real? Or was it my mind cracking under the pressure? I thought I was losing my grip. But the truth is, the fear was never really in my mind. The fear wasn't coming from me. It was coming from them. The days blur together now, a patchwork of tension and disbelief. Each morning I wake up, thinking it will be the day it stops, but it never does. If anything, it's getting worse. More intense. More real. I don't talk to anyone about it. How could I? Who would believe me? When I try to explain the growing sense of being watched, the strange occurrences that keep happening, people just look at me like I've lost my mind. They don't see it. They don't feel it. But I do. And every time I close my eyes, it's there, creeping closer. Yesterday, I was walking to work when I felt that familiar weight on my shoulders. The pressure. The sensation of being observed. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my pulse quickening. My steps became faster, more erratic, until I finally reached the office. When I sat down at my desk, the sense of being watched didn't go away. It followed me. I glanced up at the clock, 10:15 a.m. Just a regular day. But then I saw something that made my heart skip. There was a note on my desk. A small piece of paper folded neatly, as though someone had placed it there carefully. I hadn't seen it before, and no one had entered my office while I was sitting at my desk. I unfolded it slowly, my fingers trembling. The note was simple, written in clean, neat handwriting. Stop looking for me. I know what you're thinking. My throat tightened and my vision blurred for a moment. I looked around again. No one. The office was just as it had been the moment I walked in, yet something felt off. The air was thick, oppressive. Was it possible that someone was really watching me? But who could it be? Who could be leaving these messages, these warnings, without me ever seeing them? I had to know. I had to see it for myself. I stood up, feeling my legs shake as I grabbed my bag. I couldn't stay here. Not now. I had to get out. As I walked through the office, I caught sight of Linda from accounting in the hallway. She smiled at me, too wide, too forced. She looked at me as though she knew exactly what I had just read, though there was no way she could have known. My skin prickled. I forced a smile in return and hurried past her, my pulse racing. I didn't stop to talk. I couldn't. I reached the elevator, and just as the doors closed, I glanced over my shoulder. The hallway seemed darker, and I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the far end, watching me. I blinked, but when I looked again, it was gone. I exhaled shakily, the doors closing between me and whatever it was that followed me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. Something was happening. Something was watching me, controlling me. I felt it more than I could explain. I made it home, barely able to breathe, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being haunted. The walls felt like they were closing in. Every little sound was amplified. The creak of the floorboards. The hum of the refrigerator. The silence that stretched between each sound, thick and heavy. And then, as if the house itself were holding its breath, I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, barely audible, but there. A voice, low and indistinct, like it was coming from inside the walls themselves. I froze. My heart stopped. It was so quiet, so subtle, yet unmistakable. The whisper repeated, "I see you." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, as the voice continued. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, something that knew me, knew my every fear, my every doubt. And it was waiting. I ran to the door, throwing it open, gasping for air, desperate to escape whatever was in this house with me. But the street outside was empty, calm, and I was alone. I shut the door, leaning against it, my legs giving out from under me. I slid to the floor, shaking, my mind racing. Was I losing it? Or was this real? That was the moment I understood. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. There was someone or something out there, watching me. And it had been there all along. And now it knew I knew. The days are a blur now, slipping through my fingers like water. The tension is constant, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, wrapping itself tighter around me with each passing hour. I can't escape it. I can't escape them. I woke up this morning, but I wasn't sure if it was really morning at all. The light outside my window seemed muted, strange, like the sun was struggling to shine through some kind of thick fog. I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right, but it lingered, tugging at me. I went about my usual routine, but nothing felt the same. The air in my apartment was thick with unease, as if it was holding its breath. Even the floorboards seemed to creak louder beneath my feet, each step amplifying the silence around me. While I went to make coffee, I noticed something different on the kitchen counter, a piece of paper. It was folded in half, just like the one I'd found at my desk. My pulse quickened as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. I unfolded it slowly, half expecting the same message as before. But it wasn't the same. This one was different. This time, the handwriting was shakier, more erratic. I can hear your thoughts. I blinked, staring at the words as though they were written in a language I couldn't understand. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced. How? How could anyone hear my thoughts? Who could be so close, so inside my head? Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was this something much worse? Something I couldn't explain? I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in, the air growing thicker, suffocating. My head spun, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse. But I steadied myself, taking shallow breaths, trying to push the panic back down. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. There was something out there, something that had been watching me, listening to me, controlling me. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was real. I had to confront it. I had to figure out what this thing wanted from me. The day dragged on, each minute stretching endlessly. The sense of being watched never left. Every time I thought I was alone, every time I turned my back, I felt that cold weight on my shoulders. The eyes that weren't there. The invisible presence that followed me everywhere I went. I tried to focus on work, but it was impossible. The sound of my keyboard tapping seemed too loud, too sharp. The air conditioning in the office hummed incessantly in the background, adding to the noise. The constant hum of it all started to drown out everything else, making it harder to concentrate. At lunch, I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, desperate for some sense of normalcy. But as I walked down the street, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Across the road, in front of a coffee shop, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was just a passerby, someone lost in their own world. But as I stared, I realized they were staring right at me. Not just a casual glance. Their eyes were fixed on mine, unmoving. I couldn't tell who they were. Their face was obscured by a hood, their features hidden in the shadows. But I felt it. I felt the presence. The same cold, suffocating pressure that I'd felt in my apartment. The same weight that pressed down on me when I was at work. It was them. I turned quickly, walking faster, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I rushed away from the figure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were following me. That they were there, just out of sight, always just behind me. I made it back to my apartment, but the sense of dread didn't leave. In fact, it had only grown stronger. It was like the very air had turned against me, thick with something I couldn't explain. I sat in the middle of the room, my hands shaking. I didn't know who to trust anymore. My own mind was betraying me, filling with fear and doubt. But there was something else too. A growing awareness, a gnawing realization that this thing, this invisible presence, was manipulating me, guiding me in some way. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't outrun it. No matter where I went, it was always there, always waiting. And the worst part? I was starting to wonder if it was inside me now too. If I'd already lost. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind entirely, I heard it again. That whisper. But this time, it was different. It was closer. Right behind me. I told you to stop looking. I froze. I didn't dare move. The whispering voice was unmistakable now, echoing in my mind like a chill that wouldn't go away. I didn't have to look. I already knew. It wasn't just watching me. It had me. And I had no idea how to get away. I couldn't breathe. My body felt heavy, as though the very air was pressing down on me, trapping me in this suffocating reality. The voice, its voice, was still echoing in my head. The whisper had been so close, I could feel the chill of it on my skin. I had to get out. I stood up, legs unsteady beneath me, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. The apartment felt too small, too confined. I needed to leave. I needed to escape. But where could I go? I stumbled towards the door, my fingers fumbling as I tried to unlock it. My breath was shallow, each inhale shaky as I forced myself to calm down. I couldn't let it take me. I had to stay in control. I had to find a way out. The door clicked open, and I stepped into the hallway, the coldness of the building's concrete floor sending a jolt of shock through me. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. But even the hum felt wrong. It felt like it was coming from somewhere else. I turned the corner and walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The farther I went, the more the feeling of being watched grew. I couldn't shake it. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was no one there. Still, it felt like someone was lurking in the shadows, just out of view, waiting for me to make a mistake. Every time I passed an open door, I could feel the pull, as though the rooms were alive, watching me with hungry eyes. I tried to ignore it, but the pressure was unbearable. I pushed through the front door of the building, finally stepping out into the street. The fresh air hit me like a slap in the face, but it didn't help. The weight was still there. That unseen presence, hovering just beyond my reach, was always with me. I tried to walk as fast as I could, but my legs felt stiff, as though they weren't fully under my control. Every turn, every alley I passed, felt like a trap. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was closing in. I knew I had to do something, anything, to stop it. But what? I didn't know how to fight this. How could I fight something that wasn't even real? How could I fight a voice in my head, a presence that could be anywhere and nowhere all at once? And then, without warning, I heard it again. That voice. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, clearer. Stop running. I froze. The words cut through the air like a knife, sharp and demanding. My pulse raced, and I instinctively looked around. But there was no one. Not a soul in sight. The street was empty, save for the distant hum of city traffic. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a plea. "You already know," the voice replied, cold and detached. "It's always been you." I stumbled back, my back hitting the brick wall of the building behind me. I gripped my head, trying to make sense of the words, trying to keep the panic from taking over. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But it was. It was real, and it was here. And then it hit me, like a sudden wave crashing over me. It knew me. This thing wasn't just watching me. It was me. It had been me all along. I had no idea how long I stood there, frozen in place, the realization seeping into my mind, making everything feel like a bad dream. A twisted, dark version of my own reality. But somehow, I knew the truth. It had been there before, hidden beneath the surface, like some shadow lurking in the corners of my life. I felt my legs buckle beneath me as the weight of the thought crashed down. I tried to stand, but my body refused to obey. I collapsed onto the pavement, my hands gripping the cold concrete as I gasped for air. I could hear it again, that voice, closer now, right inside my mind. "I've always been here." My breath hitched to my throat. I couldn't take it. I couldn't handle this anymore. I was losing my grip on everything, on what was real and what wasn't. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the voice fell silent. For a moment, everything was still. The world around me felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't know what would come next, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That whatever it was, whatever was happening, it was going to get worse. I struggled to get to my feet, my legs shaking violently, but I made myself stand. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't just let it have me. I had to fight. I had to find a way to stop it. But how? What was I supposed to do? I didn't have the answers. I didn't even have a plan. I only had one choice, to keep moving. I don't remember how I made it back to my apartment. It's like the world between that moment on the street and now is all a blur, a strange gap in my memory that I can't quite fill. But somehow, I found myself back here, in this suffocating room. The walls feel closer now, the shadows darker, and I don't know how to make sense of it. I've locked every door, every window. I've covered every light with blankets, hoping it'll keep it out. But no matter how many layers of protection I try to put up, I can still feel the presence. It's here. Always here. The air is thick, and every sound sends a jolt through my spine. A car passing outside, a footstep in the hallway. Is it real? Is it just my mind? I can't tell anymore. I'm losing myself. And I'm afraid that whatever's happening to me, it's not something I can outrun. It began as whispers, little things that tugged at the edges of my awareness. But now I can feel it. I feel it deep in my chest, a constant pressure, like a hand on my heart. The voice doesn't just speak anymore. It commands me. Stay in the dark, it says, over and over. And I can't escape it. The words echo, haunting me in the silence, like a broken record that won't stop. I feel the weight of it pressing on my chest as though it's filling me, sinking into me. Every breath feels too shallow, too tight. And then there's a sound. A soft scratch, like nails dragging across wood. I freeze, holding my breath. No. I squeeze my eyes shut, praying, wishing, begging for it to stop. But the sound grows louder. Closer. Scratch. 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 I open my eyes slowly, and I see it. A shadow, darker than the rest, moving along the far wall of my room. It shifts unnaturally, like it's slipping between the edges of my perception, like it doesn't belong here at all. My heart pounds. I can't move. My body feels numb. But my mind screams, telling me to run, to get out. I try to stand, but my legs won't respond. I can't move. I'm trapped. Again. I feel the pressure of it intensifying. The presence. It's closer now, so close that I can almost feel its breath on my neck. I want to scream, but the words get stuck in my throat. It whispers again, but this time it's not just a command. It's a question. Why do you keep running? I don't know how to answer. I don't know what to say to something that isn't real, to something that is me, yet isn't. But the fear in my chest makes me want to scream anyway. I can't fight it. I can't escape it. The longer I stay, the tighter the walls feel. The air is heavy with something I can't explain, something that presses against my skin, pushing me towards something I can't even begin to understand. It's in the shadows, in the space between my thoughts, and in the pulse of my heart. It's everywhere. I want to stop. I want to find peace. But how can I, when the line between what's real and what's not is so thin? How can I trust myself when I don't even know who I am anymore? I finally manage to take a step, my feet unsteady beneath me. I move toward the door. But as I reach for the handle, I hear it. That voice. But it's different now. It's not just in my mind anymore. It's behind me, right here. I feel it. I feel it right in the room with me. You can't leave. The door creaks open before I even touch it. The hallway outside is dark. Empty. And still, that nagging feeling that something is there, something watching me, presses against my back. I step into the hallway, heart pounding so hard I think it might explode. The air is thick with the stench of old, stale smoke, and I feel a chill in the bones of my fingers, a coldness that seeps through me like ice. I take one slow step, then another, and then another. The building is silent, but not in the way it should be. It feels as if every surface, every inch of space, is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It's a strange quiet, like something is about to break, something is about to snap. The floor creaks beneath my feet. Scratch. Scratch. I freeze. The sound is getting louder, closer. I can feel it on my neck, the same sensation I felt before. A hand, invisible, but pressing against my skin. I turn. And there it is. A shadow. A figure, barely visible, standing at the end of the hallway. And then it moves. It doesn't walk. It glides like a dark wisp of smoke, coming toward me with an unnerving, deliberate slowness. I stumble backward, but the door slams shut behind me, trapping me in the hallway with it. It's too close now. I can't breathe. I can't think. I can only feel that presence, cold and suffocating, closing in on me from all sides. I scream, but no sound escapes my lips. The figure is inches away, the blackness of it filling my vision, and for the first time, I see it clearly. But not entirely. The face, if you could call it that, is twisted. It's almost human, but not quite. The features are distorted, warped, like they're constantly shifting. But I know, deep in my gut, I know that it's not the face of someone else. It's mine. It's me. And the last thing I hear before the darkness swallows me whole is its voice. You can't escape. It started with a question. A simple one, yet enough to unravel the fabric of everything I knew. Are you sure you haven't seen it yet? The words weren't spoken aloud, but they burned in my mind the moment I woke up. I couldn't remember where they had come from or what they meant, but I couldn't shake them. I sat in my room, staring at the same four walls, feeling like something was wrong. I live in a small town, a place that should feel familiar. Yet, the longer I stayed here, the more it seemed like the world was quietly shifting beneath my feet. Things were changing, but I couldn't pinpoint how. The house felt different this morning, colder somehow. The creaking of the floorboards echoed more than usual, and I noticed the faint smell of something burning, though nothing was on fire. It lingered, like the remnants of a dream that I couldn't quite recall. I got up and went to the kitchen, the fluorescent lights flickering above me. The sound of the fridge humming in the background was almost too loud, as if the silence around me was screaming. But I brushed it off. After all, it was just a bad night of sleep, right? As I poured my coffee, something caught my eye. A small envelope, wedged between two books on the counter. There was no return address. No name. Just my handwriting, my name written in black ink on the front. I froze, my fingers lingering on the paper. How could I have written this? I hadn't even opened the door. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, almost as if it had been waiting for me. I tore it open, the paper inside yellowed with age. The message was short but precise. You will receive what you fear most, soon. I could feel my heart pounding, the words searing into my mind like a warning. What did it mean? How did it know? A strange chill ran through me. Something had shifted in the air, something I couldn't explain. It was like a piece of me had been pulled into another world, one where time itself had betrayed me. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this letter was only the beginning. I folded the letter carefully, slipping it back into the envelope. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Every sound in the house seemed amplified now, footsteps that weren't mine, a faint murmur from outside the window, even the ticking of the clock on the wall. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it, or if something truly was different. I needed to get out. To clear my head. Stepping outside, the familiar sight of my front yard greeted me, yet it too seemed foreign. The sky, usually a calming blue, was now a deep, unsettling shade of gray. The wind rustled the leaves, but it sounded like whispers, like the trees were trying to speak to me. Are you sure you haven't seen it yet? The question resurfaced in my mind, louder this time, almost demanding an answer. But I didn't have one. I shook my head, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a knot formed in my stomach. I turned to walk down the path, but something stopped me, a rustle in the bushes nearby. It was just a squirrel, I told myself. Yet, the sound didn't match. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I reached for my phone in my pocket, but the screen was black. No signal. It felt like the world was closing in, a sense of isolation creeping over me like a fog. I heard it again, louder this time, the distinct crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, following me, matching my pace. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, moving just beyond the trees. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. I could feel my pulse racing as I stared into the space where the shadow had been. There was nothing there now, nothing but the growing tension in the air. I turned and ran back to the house, the sound of footsteps still echoing in my ears. But when I reached the front door, I stopped. It was locked. I hadn't locked it. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys. The shadow was still out there. I could feel it, lurking just beyond the edge of the yard. Finally, the door clicked open, and I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. But the question still echoed in my mind. Are you sure you haven't seen it yet? What was this thing I hadn't seen? And why did it feel like it was coming for me? I looked at the envelope again, my fingers tracing the edge of the paper. There was no answer, just a promise of something worse to come. I had received my first letter from the future, and I had no idea what it meant. I couldn't stop shaking. My hands were cold, despite the warmth of the house, and every small sound, every creak of the floor or whisper of the wind outside, seemed to crawl under my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I had locked the door. But what did that matter now? The shadow in the yard hadn't been natural. I knew that. I felt it in my bones. But the question, the same one that had been haunting me since I first saw the letter, "Are you sure you haven't seen it yet?" was growing louder. It felt like an omen, like a reminder that I was blind to something bigger than myself. I paced around the living room, my thoughts racing. My mind wouldn't stop. It kept going back to the letter. You will receive what you fear most, soon. I needed answers. But how? The house felt too quiet, almost suffocating. I couldn't focus. My eyes darted from one corner of the room to the next, and yet everything felt wrong. It wasn't just the shadows that seemed deeper today. It was the way the air moved, the strange heaviness that hung in every room. Then, as I walked past the kitchen table, something caught my eye. Another envelope. This time, I was ready. I reached for it cautiously, but my hands trembled even as I grabbed it. The paper was old again, the same yellow texture as the first one. I tore it open slowly, my breath held in anticipation. The words were written in the same black ink, the same erratic scrawl. Everything is already happening. You just don't know it yet. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. What did that mean? I stared at the letter for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Everything is already happening. The thought settled into my mind, dark and cold. The feeling of inevitability pressed against my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. It was like I was being suffocated by something unseen, something that had already taken place. I couldn't escape this. The room seemed to close in around me. The walls felt closer now, and the shadows in the corners of the room stretched longer. I heard a faint tapping sound, as if nails were gently rapping against the window. I spun around. There was nothing there, but I could feel it. The tap, tap, tap. It was real. It was like someone, where something was trying to get in. I moved toward the window, my feet dragging as if the floor itself was fighting me. My reflection in the glass was pale, eyes wide, heart hammering. There was nothing outside, no one watching. But the tapping continued, rhythmic and unrelenting. Stop it, I told myself. Just stop it. You're imagining things. But the tapping didn't stop. It wasn't just the glass. It was coming from the walls now, too. Tap. 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 And then, something worse. A low whisper, barely audible, but there. You're running out of time. I froze. I had heard it. I hadn't imagined it. The words felt like they had been spoken directly into my ear, but when I turned, there was no one there. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. The shadows in the room stretched longer, darker, and the tapping grew louder, faster. I had to get out. I bolted for the front door, but before I could reach it, the sound of the tapping shifted. It was now a rhythmic pounding, growing more violent with each passing second. I turned toward the kitchen. The shadows had moved, now crowding around the doorway. Something was there, something that didn't belong. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Its presence was undeniable. It was as if the very space around me had twisted, and now something was pressing itself against the thin barrier between our worlds. I ran toward the back door, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It's locked. I didn't lock it. The realization hit me like a slap in the face. I hadn't locked it. But I couldn't stop now. The air was thick with panic, and the whispering was growing louder. It felt like a dozen voices all speaking at once, but none of them made sense. Are you sure you haven't seen it yet? There it was again, the question. This time, it felt like a command. It echoed through the walls, through the very air I breathed. I had to get out. I had to escape. I looked around, my eyes wild, searching for an answer. But the shadows were closing in. They were moving now, crawling up the walls, stretching toward me. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. Then I heard it, a soft, familiar sound. The sound of a letter slipping through the mail slot. No. Not again. I moved toward the door, my feet heavy with dread. I didn't want to open it. But I had to. I crouched down and reached for the letter, and as soon as my fingers brushed against the envelope, the whispering stopped. The air around me stilled, and for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, I had imagined it all. But when I opened the letter, the words were written in the same scroll, the same ink. You have already seen it. I didn't know what that meant. But I knew one thing for certain, whatever was happening, whatever was coming, it was not over. It was just beginning. I stood there, staring at the letter, feeling the weight of its meaning pressed down on me. Something was coming for me. And I was running out of time. The words on the paper blurred in front of my eyes as I struggled to breathe. You have already seen it. The sentence didn't make sense, not in the way I wanted it to. It felt like a warning, a truth that I wasn't ready to understand. I stood in the kitchen, the envelope clenched in my trembling hands. The air was stifling, and yet I could feel a cold draft, as if the walls themselves were breathing. The shadows in the room had shifted again, longer, darker. They seemed to stretch toward me like fingers, curling and writhing as if alive. But when I looked directly at them, they remained still, almost mockingly normal. I glanced down at the letter again. There had to be something more. Some clue I was missing. But the words, just those few simple words, were all that lay on the page. And in my mind, that question still echoed. Are you sure you haven't seen it yet? I turned the paper over in my hands, searching for anything else, any other hint. But there was nothing. Nothing except the overwhelming sense that something had already been set into motion and I was powerless to stop it. I felt like I was drowning, unable to escape the sensation that time itself was folding in on me. My mind raced through all the possibilities, but none of them made sense. How could I have seen it? What was it? And why did the world feel like it was turning against me? I walked toward the living room, needing to get away from the oppressive silence of the kitchen. The house seemed smaller now, as though the walls were slowly closing in on me. The air felt heavier with each step I took, and the silence was suffocating, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I reached the window, staring out into the yard. The shadows beyond the glass were thicker now, as if the world outside had been swallowed by some unseen force. But there was no movement. No sign of the creature, or whatever it was, that I had seen last time. But that didn't mean it wasn't there. I turned back to the front door, to the very spot where I had received the first letter. My heart skipped a beat as I thought about the moment I had opened it, the chill that had flooded through me when I saw the envelope waiting for me. The air in the room seemed to hum with a growing tension and anticipation that made my skin crawl. And then I heard it. The soft, faint rustling that seemed to come from the walls. It was subtle at first, like the sound of paper brushing against itself. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from inside the house, from the walls themselves. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise stopped, but the room felt wrong. The stillness was thick, almost suffocating. My pulse was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I moved to the doorway, my hand hovering over the handle. My breath came in shallow bursts, the silence around me deafening. I felt like I was on the edge of something, a precipice, and one wrong move would send me plummeting into whatever this was. The moment I touched the door, it creaked open on its own, as if something had been waiting for me to make the first move. But there was no wind. No draft. The door had simply opened. I stepped out, the cool night air biting at my skin. I had to get away from the house. Away from whatever was happening inside it. But as I reached the end of the driveway, I stopped. There, on the ground in front of me, lay another envelope. I hesitated, staring at it. How could this be happening again? My hand trembled as I crouched down, my fingers brushing against the paper. It was old again, the same yellow texture, the same ink. But this time, there was no name on the front. Just a series of numbers and letters, some sort of code. I tore it open, and my eyes skimmed the message quickly. Don't try to run. You're already here. I froze. The words hit me like a slap in the face. It was almost as if the letter knew exactly what I was thinking, what I was planning. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark and silent. The world around me seemed strangely still, as if time itself had been suspended. And for the first time since I had received the first letter, I felt something that made my blood run cold. I couldn't escape this. I couldn't outrun whatever was happening. It had already caught up to me. I backed away from the house, my heart hammering in my chest. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. The air around me felt heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch out from every corner. I had no idea what was waiting for me, what it was, but I knew one thing for certain: it was close. I heard something behind me. A faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was the same voice I had heard before. The voice from the walls. "You're running out of time." The ground beneath me seemed to shift, and for a moment I felt disoriented, like the world was tilting. The shadows, once just darkened corners of the room, now felt like they were alive, crawling toward me. I couldn't stay here. I had to move. But every step I took felt like it was dragging me deeper into this nightmare. I ran. But where was I running to? I ran. The world around me blurred into a haze as I pushed myself harder, my breath ragged, my feet pounding against the cracked pavement. Every instinct screamed at me to escape, but I didn't know where I was going. The cold air stung my skin, the rustling wind felt too loud, too harsh. It was as if the very atmosphere was trying to choke me. And yet, despite the frantic pace, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trailing behind me, watching, waiting. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was there, always just out of reach, soft footsteps, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably present. It was like someone was walking in step with me, but when I turned, there was no one there. No one but the dark, empty street stretching out before me. I couldn't trust my senses anymore. Everything felt warped. Every sound, every movement felt like part of a distorted reality. The world was slipping away, becoming something foreign, something I couldn't control. But the letter. That damn letter. "You're already here." That phrase echoed in my mind over and over, like a cruel reminder that no matter how far I ran, I would never be able to outrun this. I had already crossed some invisible line, and there was no going back. I turned a corner, my eyes scanning the darkened buildings. The streets were empty, but they didn't feel empty. The air hung thick with something I couldn't name. A presence. A sense of being watched. The pavement beneath my feet felt uneven now, as though it, too, was shifting with each step I took. I felt disoriented, my mind foggy, and that feeling of being trapped deepened with every second. I didn't know where I was anymore. The familiar street names that once anchored me now seemed meaningless. The buildings were distorted, as if they had been twisted by some unseen force. The once familiar landscape was now unrecognizable. Then, ahead of me, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie, jagged shadows across the sidewalk. And in the middle of the road, standing perfectly still, was a figure. A person? No, not quite. They were tall, impossibly tall, their silhouette dark against the flickering light. But it wasn't just their height that made my skin crawl. It was the way they stood. Rigid, unnaturally still. Almost too still, like a mannequin left out in the cold. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. But I could feel it. The sense that it was waiting for me. I froze, my heart pounding, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, to run in the opposite direction. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the ground, held in place by some invisible force. It's not real, I told myself. It's just a hallucination. Just a trick of the mind. But then the figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't step. It shifted, the way something out of place might distort reality around it. It was like watching a figure slide through the air, bending space and time with every movement. The way it moved was wrong, unnatural, as though it was no longer bound by the laws of physics. It was the stuff of nightmares, something that couldn't exist in the real world. Something that should never exist. I tried to scream, to run, but the words stuck in my throat. The air was thick with dread, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe. The figure was getting closer, each step, or rather, each shift, filling me with a growing sense of hopelessness. It was getting closer, but it didn't seem to be walking. It was gliding, an unnerving fluidity that made it seem otherworldly. I need to get out of here. But my feet were still frozen, and the figure was so close now, I could feel the cold that surrounded it. It felt like a presence of death, a void. And it was right there, right in front of me. The whispers began again. "You're running out of time." The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me, echoing in my skull. But this time, there was something else. A sharpness. An edge to the voice that wasn't there before. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a command. I jerked back, breaking free of the spell, my legs moving once more. I ran. But the figure didn't chase me. It didn't need to. It was everywhere. I could feel its presence in the very air, in the ground beneath my feet. Every corner I turned, every alley I ran down, seemed to loop back to the same place. I was trapped in some kind of sick maze, and the walls were closing in. I reached the end of the street and stopped dead in my tracks. It was impossible. The house. My house. I had come back. I stared at the familiar structure, but now, under the pale moonlight, it looked wrong. The shadows that clung to it were deeper, more aggressive. They moved with a purpose. They reached toward me, as if trying to pull me back into the nightmare I had been running from. But it was too late to run now. The figure was behind me again. It hadn't moved, it had simply appeared. And the whispers had turned into a chant, a relentless mantra that filled my mind, drowning out everything else. "You've already seen it." I turned back to the house, the door looming before me. It wasn't just the door that terrified me, it was the feeling that if I stepped inside, I would never leave. That once I crossed that threshold, I would be part of this endless cycle, bound by something I didn't understand. And yet, despite the fear, despite the overwhelming sense of doom, my hand reached for the door handle. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the cold, metal door handle. The whispers still clung to the edges of my thoughts, relentless and suffocating. "You've already seen it." The words echoed again, but this time they weren't just words. They were a promise. A promise that something was going to happen. Something that I couldn't control. I pulled my hand away, but the door swung open by itself. The house beckoned me, its dark, empty halls stretching endlessly. I could feel the oppressive weight of its silence pressing against me, like a living thing, hungry for something I couldn't yet understand. The shadows inside seemed to move of their own accord, flickering and crawling along the walls like dark tendrils, reaching out for me. The air was thick and cold, but it wasn't the temperature that sent a chill down my spine, it was the overwhelming sense that this place knew me. It knew everything about me. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world shifted. Everything seemed sharper now, too sharp. The edges of the room blurred and twisted, and the shadows on the walls stretched in ways that defied logic. The house felt alive, as if it were breathing, the walls pulsing with some dark energy that had been locked away for far too long. I took a step forward, my pulse quickening. The air felt wrong, unnaturally thick, like I was walking through a fog that wasn't there. It was as if the house itself was rejecting me, pushing me deeper into its grasp. Suddenly, a sound broke through the suffocating silence, a soft, low sound. A dragging noise. It came from above, from the second floor, but it was slow and deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving across the floorboards. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped, right above me. Then, there was a knock. It wasn't a knock at the door. It was a knock inside my mind. A hard, sharp thud that reverberated through my skull. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me, suffocating me, until I could barely breathe. The house had changed. The familiar had become foreign. What was once a home, a place of safety, now felt like a prison. The walls closed in on me, and the air seemed to pulse with something dark, something ancient. I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the doorframe, my vision starting to blur. I couldn't escape it. It was already inside me. It had been inside me all along. The letters, the whispers, the shifting shadows, it was all connected. It had always been connected. You've already seen it. I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was standing in the doorway, but this time it was different. It wasn't just an outline anymore. It was a shape, a person, but not quite. Its features were distorted, like something that was halfway between reality and a nightmare. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and unnatural. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was barely human. There was a mouth, a gaping, dark void that seemed to swallow the very light around it. And the eyes. The eyes were the worst part. They weren't eyes at all, not really. They were hollow, empty spaces filled with an inky blackness that seemed to pull me in, drowning me in its emptiness. I could feel the pull. You've already seen it. The voice was louder now, louder than the whispers, louder than my own thoughts. It was everywhere, inside my head, in my chest, in my bones. It was all around me. It was me. I backed away from the figure, my legs shaking beneath me, my feet stumbling over the floorboards. I needed to get out. I needed to run. But there was nowhere to go. I had already crossed that line. There was no escape. The figure stepped forward, and the darkness around it seemed to bend and warp. The shadows twisted, spiraling around its body like smoke, rising up to choke the light out of the room. I could hear its slow, deliberate footsteps now, each one a heavy, unnatural thud that seemed to echo through the very walls. I turned and ran, my mind screaming at me to get away, to escape this place, but the house was alive, the corridors stretching endlessly, trapping me. It was too late. I ran and ran, but the house was always ahead of me, the shadows always just a step behind. The rooms seemed to change with every turn, the walls shifting, the air thickening. Then I heard it again. The voice. It was louder now, clearer, like it was right beside me. It's too late. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. I turned, but the figure was already there, standing just inches away from me. I could feel its presence, like an invisible weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. The darkness around it seemed to close in on me, cutting off all light, all hope. And then, I saw it. The truth. The thing that had been haunting me, lurking in the shadows, in the whispers. I had already seen it. I had already lived through it. The letters. The house. The figure. It was all a part of the same thing, a loop. A loop that had already happened and now would happen again. I was stuck. There was no escaping it. There was no future. There was only this. Only the darkness. And the figure. It was me. It had always been me. I couldn't breathe. The weight of the darkness pressed against my chest, my lungs refusing to take in air. The figure, towering over me, felt like a storm cloud, its presence filling every inch of the room, suffocating me. Its hollow eyes never left me. I could feel them, no, I could sense them, like a pressure inside my skull, scraping against my sanity. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. My body trembled, the words rattling in my head, but they were useless. Reality had worked. The very fabric of my surroundings had crumbled, leaving me with this thing. It was a grotesque mockery of what should have been a person, a being that twisted everything I thought I knew about fear. I wanted to look away, to escape into the illusion of safety that used to exist in the familiar shadows of my life, but there was no going back. I had already crossed the line. You've already seen it. The voice again, louder this time, overwhelming. A low, guttural growl, like an ancient, broken machine sputtering to life. It didn't just come from the figure, it came from the very walls, from the floor beneath my feet. It was the house. The house was speaking to me. I stumbled backward, my hands scraping against the walls for balance. The floor creaked beneath my feet, the familiar sound of the old house now twisted and warped as if it, too, was protesting. The shadows around me thickened, curling toward me, wrapping around my legs, my arms. The room felt smaller now, closer, as if the house was folding in on itself, shrinking with every breath I took. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it move, in my head, in my veins. It was closing in on me, and I couldn't escape it. You've already seen it, it whispered, the words no longer just echoes, but a command, a truth I could no longer deny. The letter. The warnings. The strange, distant knowledge that had been fed to me piece by piece through time. I staggered away from the figure, my legs unsteady, my mind unraveling as everything around me grew more distorted. I reached for the door, desperate for an exit, but it slammed shut in my face before I could even touch the handle. The room locked me in. It was as if the house itself had become alive, a sentient, breathing entity that didn't want me to leave. I heard a creak, a groan, deep within the walls, as if the house was stretching, preparing to consume me whole. Then the walls began to shift. The shape of the room was no longer static. The edges began to blur, the corners folding and unfolding like paper caught in the wind. The floor beneath me cracked, though it's splintering like dry bones. I could feel it. The house wasn't just a place anymore. It was alive. It was part of whatever force had trapped me here. A part of whatever had been feeding on me since the moment I opened that first letter. It's too late. The voice sounded familiar now, but not just because of its relentless repetition. No, it was the tone, an echo of my own thoughts. It was me. It had been me all along, just as I had always suspected. I had already seen it. This was the loop, the endless cycle. The more I struggled, the deeper I sank into it. The more I tried to break free, the more I became a part of it. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut as hard as I could, trying to shut out the unbearable reality. But no matter how hard I tried to block it out, the darkness only grew. The whispering grew louder, closer. You've seen it. and you will see it again. I felt a presence behind me, and when I turned around, the figure was there again. But this time, it wasn't just in front of me. It was all around me. It was the walls. It was the ceiling. It was the floor beneath my feet. The very air I breathed was thick with it. It was me, and it was the house. We are the same. The figure's mouth stretched open, too wide, impossibly wide, and something emerged from it. A darkness that swallowed everything, that devoured all light. It wasn't just a shadow, it was an absence. A void. I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me toward it, drowning me in its emptiness. I stumbled back, but my legs were too weak. I fell, hitting the floor with a dull thud. I tried to move, to get up, but I couldn't. The void consumed the space around me, swallowing up everything I had ever known, everything I had ever believed in. My thoughts began to blur, and I could feel my sense of self slipping away. The more I struggled, the less I felt like myself, until there was nothing left. Just the void. Just the house. Just the loop. The truth was simple. I had always been here. And I would always be here. The whispers faded, and everything went quiet. I opened my eyes, and I was back at the beginning. The door stood before me, just as it had the first time. But this time, I didn't feel the same hesitation. This time, I knew. I knew what was waiting for me. I stepped forward. The door opened. Have you ever wondered if the world you see is the same world that others see? What if, one day, you looked in the mirror and the reflection staring back at you wasn't really you? I didn't think about it much before. Mirrors were just mirrors, nothing more than silent windows into the present, showing you exactly who you were, where you stood. But that was before the night I shattered one. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind that feels too calm. The house was still, every corner bathed in the soft amber glow of the lamplight. I was cleaning the attic, something I'd put off for far too long, and had just uncovered an old, dusty mirror. It was large, framed in dark wood, its surface cracked along the edge. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd always been fascinated by old things, relics of the past, things that carried with them some unspoken history. But as I wiped the dust away and saw my reflection, I felt something stir deep inside me, something wrong. At first, I brushed it off as a trick of the dim lighting. But then it happened again. My reflection flickered. For a fraction of a second, it didn't move as I did. It was slower. A shadow of myself, but different. My breath hitched. The room felt colder, the air heavier, but I couldn't look away. I reached out to touch the glass, my fingers grazing its surface. And that's when the crack formed, just a small, sharp sound. I pulled my hand back, startled. But when I glanced at the mirror again, something was different. The reflection didn't match anymore. It wasn't just that I looked different, it was more than that. It was as if I had stepped into another world. My movements were slower. My face looked older, more worn, and my eyes, seemed to be looking at me with a kind of recognition. Not a reflection of me, but of something else. Someone else. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but it only made it worse. The air around me grew thicker, heavier. The stillness was overwhelming. My heartbeat pulsed in my ears. I wanted to turn away, to step back, but something held me in place, an invisible force that kept my eyes fixed on the glass. Then it cracked again. I didn't realize at first how the glass had splintered. It was as if time itself had shattered. Each fragment of the mirror revealed another version of me, slightly different, but all the same. Different in ways that were too small to understand at first, but too unsettling to ignore. The reflection in the broken pieces, all of them, were not me anymore. They were other versions of myself, moving in ways that felt wrong, twisting into shapes I couldn't recognize. I backed away, my heart pounding as the cracks seemed to grow, spreading like veins across the glass. My mind was racing. Was it possible? I looked away from the mirror, but the echoes of those reflections lingered in my mind, haunting me. I knew then. I had broken something. Something that had kept me grounded in this reality, this world. The mirror, the reflections, it wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something else. Something beyond understanding. I stepped back again, my breath shallow, my head spinning. The house around me had started to feel wrong, empty, like a hollow shell. The air was still, but there was something alive in it now. And it wasn't just in the attic. It was everywhere. The house felt too big, too silent. And outside, the world I once knew, seemed distant. The sounds were muffled, as if they were coming from a place that was no longer connected to me. And I realized, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that my reflection was no longer mine. It had changed, just as I had. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. What had I done? I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the mirror, my mind spinning in chaos. The reflection wasn't just strange, it was wrong. The more I looked at it, the less I recognized myself. It was like seeing a version of me I didn't want to face. It wasn't just the cracks in the glass, it was the world beyond them. I backed away slowly, afraid to turn my back to it. The air in the room felt heavier, colder, pressing against me like something alive. I glanced around the attic, trying to focus on something familiar. The boxes. The dusty furniture. The old rocking chair in the corner. But even these things felt different now, as though I was seeing them through a filter, as if they weren't mine anymore. A low creak echoed from somewhere deep in the house, distant but clear. I froze. My heart began to race. The house wasn't quiet anymore. It wasn't still. It was alive, too, with the same heaviness in the air. The floorboards seemed to groan under the weight of something unseen, something lurking in the shadows, waiting. I glanced back at the mirror. The reflection, my reflection, had shifted again. It moved without my command, a subtle change. My fingers twitched, but the reflection didn't mirror me. Instead, it tilted its head, just a fraction of a movement, like it was studying me. I could feel it, it was watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, my mind reeling. How was this possible? Was I seeing things? Or had the mirror somehow changed? The crack. The broken glass. It had torn open something. A crack between this world and another. A world where things didn't make sense, where nothing was as it should be. I backed out of the attic, my footsteps faltering, unsure. The house seemed to stretch before me, its corners sharp, the shadows too deep. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, its light flickering, as though the house itself wasn't sure whether to hold onto its form. The distant sound of the creak came again, closer this time. My breath quickened. Something was wrong. I needed to leave. Get out of here. but my feet were stuck. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the air was pushing back, forcing me to stay. Then came the sound, distant at first, but growing louder, clearer. It was my voice. My own voice, but twisted. It wasn't speaking words. It was echoing back at me. The sounds were distorted, the way an old record warbles when it's scratched. It didn't make sense, but there was no mistaking it. My reflection was speaking. It was mimicking me, mocking me. I turned sharply, my heart racing as the hallway stretched impossibly long before me. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing down. The sound was coming from everywhere now, the walls, the floor, the ceiling. My own voice. But it wasn't mine anymore. I stumbled into the kitchen, my eyes darting around for any sign of something familiar. The light flickered again, casting eerie shadows that danced and shifted like living things. The cabinets were slightly ajar, their insides dark. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. And then I saw it. The mirror. The other mirror. It was small, sitting on the counter, hidden behind a stack of old books. I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't a reflection of me, though. It was a reflection of the kitchen, of the room I was standing in, but something was wrong. The colors were off. The shadows were too sharp. The air around it seemed to throb, vibrating with a frequency I couldn't hear but could feel deep in my chest. I reached out, my hand trembling, unable to stop myself. My fingers brushed against the surface of the glass, and for a moment everything went still. The sound, the shifting air, the pulse of something unknown, it all disappeared. The silence was thick, oppressive, as if time itself had frozen. And then, just as suddenly, a voice whispered in my ear, my voice, but so distant, so detached. It didn't sound like me. It sounded like a warning. You broke it. You broke the world. I jerked back, my heart hammering. The mirror didn't move. It didn't reflect anything I could understand. I stumbled away, hands shaking, my mind reeling. What was happening? Was I going insane? Or had I somehow crossed over into another world, one where the laws of reality no longer applied? But the question didn't matter. The moment I touched that mirror, I had shattered something. And now, everything was shifting. The world I knew was no longer mine. And the worst part? I didn't know how to get back. The air in the kitchen felt colder now, and every breath seemed to freeze in my lungs. I couldn't focus. The room was shifting. No, it wasn't shifting. I was. My mind couldn't grasp what was happening. Was it the house warping, or was I being pulled into something else entirely? Something darker, stranger, beyond comprehension? The mirror on the counter seemed to glow, but faintly. A soft, almost imperceptible light emanated from it. It pulsed like a heartbeat. I couldn't look away, and yet I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. My reflection in the mirror, the other me, stared back, unmoving, almost expectantly, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. But what was I supposed to do? How did one fight a reflection? I reached out with a shaking hand, not sure what I was expecting to find. My fingers hovered just above the glass, the air around it humming with energy. It felt wrong, like I was about to touch something that was never meant to be touched. My reflection didn't move. It didn't change. But I did. The glass rippled. I rippled. My reflection twisted like water disturbed by a stone, distorting my features, stretching them, warping them into something unrecognizable. A cold, clammy feeling washed over me. I jerked my hand back, but the damage had been done. The reflection wasn't me anymore. It was something else. Not again, I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. I stepped backward, my heart racing, as I felt something shift behind me. The kitchen, a room that was supposed to be safe, familiar, no longer felt like mine. It felt foreign, like it wasn't supposed to exist here. The walls, once steady, seemed to breathe with an unnatural rhythm. The air was too thick, almost suffocating, and the floor beneath me creaked, groaning as though the house itself was alive, shifting with some unholy intention. And then I heard it. A soft scratching noise, like fingernails dragging across wood. Slow, deliberate, intentional. I spun around, every muscle in my body tight with fear, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, thick and oppressive, lurking in the corners of the room. I turned back to the mirror. It wasn't just reflecting the kitchen anymore. The reflection was changing. The kitchen in the mirror was somehow darker, the light dimming with each passing second. And in the reflection, I saw someone. It wasn't me. Not exactly. But it looked like me. It wore my clothes, stood in the same position I had been moments before. But there was something wrong about the way it stood, its posture too stiff, its face frozen in an expression I couldn't place. It was as if my reflection was trapped inside a world of its own, and it could do nothing but watch. "Get out," I muttered under my breath, my hands trembling at my sides. It was a simple command, one I wished I could follow. But the reflection in the mirror? It didn't obey. Instead, it did the opposite. It raised its hand, my hand, toward the glass. Slowly, methodically. And when it touched the mirror, the world around me shifted. I stumbled backward, the floor cracking beneath my feet as if the house itself was splitting apart. The kitchen blurred before me, its edges stretching, elongating into a distorted version of itself. The walls, once smooth and familiar, became jagged and uneven. Everything felt wrong, as if the room was no longer bound by the same rules of space I once knew. And then the air changed. The light in the room dimmed even further, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls, as though the day itself was dying. My reflection in the mirror seemed to smile at me, slowly, unnervingly, before its face shifted, becoming otherworldly. The eyes grew larger, darker, and the skin stretched unnaturally, as if it were made from something that wasn't human. The mouth, the smile, stretched far too wide, impossible, like something out of a nightmare. I wanted to scream, but the words lodged themselves in my throat. The reflection, it was alive, and it was not my reflection anymore. It was a version of me from a twisted, broken world, a world where things didn't work like they were supposed to. A loud crash broke through the silence. The mirror trembled as if it were shaking with the force of the sound. The reflection reached out, the fingers tapping against the glass, but instead of touching the surface, they disappeared into it. The air became heavy with a low hum, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. I backed away, desperate to escape. But then it happened. The door, the one I knew led into the hallway, wasn't there anymore. The walls were gone. I was standing in an empty, black void. The air was thick with a sense of wrongness. A place where time and space had no meaning. The pulse of the mirror's energy was growing louder, like a heartbeat growing ever more frantic. I turned around. The reflection still stood there. But this time, it was no longer in the mirror. It was standing in front of me. And it wasn't me anymore. I froze. The thing standing in front of me, this twisted reflection of me, tilted its head, the motion unnatural, like a marionette being jerked by invisible strings. Its eyes, they weren't my eyes. They were darker, empty, as though the soul behind them had been hollowed out, replaced with something far worse. The mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, wide and toothless, like something that had been waiting for this moment for a long time. I tried to back away, but the ground beneath me seemed to ripple, like walking through water. My legs were heavy, unresponsive. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat loud enough to drown out every other sound in the space. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing, my reflection, but not myself, stepped forward, its feet barely making a sound on the warped floor. It was impossibly close now, too close, its face so near that I could feel the cold breath coming from its twisted form. It smelled like something decayed, like rot mixed with the acrid sting of metal. The air itself seemed to taste wrong, bitter and metallic, as if I had stepped into a nightmare where everything was made of lies. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It didn't matter. The thing didn't need me to scream. It already knew what I feared. What I had feared all along. Control. It was never about controlling the room, or the mirror, or even the house. It was about control over me, over my own existence. My reflection had broken free, and now I was here, in my world, playing with the rules like a child with a broken toy. The thing reached out, a slow, deliberate movement, and its fingers brushed against my cheek. Cold. So cold that it felt like my skin would freeze where it touched. I flinched, but my body didn't respond. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. You think you control reality, the thing whispered, its voice a rasping, hollow echo that reverberated in my skull. But I've been here all along, watching, waiting. You're the reflection. I'm the reality. Its voice sent a tremor through my bones. I didn't know how to respond, how to fight. This wasn't a person I could punch or run away from. This was something worse. Something that had always been just beyond the edge of my perception. The reflection stepped closer, its face inches from mine now. The air around us grew thick, oppressive. I felt like I was suffocating in the very presence of it, like my lungs couldn't hold air anymore. The thing's grin widened, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw myself, the real me, struggling to break through the mask of this thing. The reflection's lips parted, revealing jagged, malformed teeth that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. "Do you want to go home?" it whispered. "This is your home. You just don't know it yet." I wanted to move, to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. My mind screamed, "No, this isn't me. This isn't real. This can't be real." But the reflection's grip tightened, and suddenly I felt the mirror pulling at me. My vision swam, the world around me warping like a distorted image through cracked glass. The walls, no, the room was fading away, becoming a shadowy blur of what it had been. I could feel the mirror pulling, tugging at my soul. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a portal, a door to somewhere else, somewhere darker. I closed my eyes, hoping, praying that it would stop. I needed to wake up. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be real. The next thing I felt was the ground beneath me, hard, cold, alien. I opened my eyes. The kitchen was gone. Everything was gone. I wasn't in my house anymore. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. Around me stretched a vast, empty space, like being trapped in the middle of the ocean, but the water was frozen and the sky above me was black, swirling with shadows. The air was thick with a low, groaning hum, like the sound of something massive, something ancient, waking up from a long slumber. I tried to move, but my legs refused to obey. Panic surged through me as I realized I had no control over my own body. The reflection was still with me, but it was no longer just standing in front of me. It was everywhere, its presence, its weight, pressing down on me like 1,000 eyes watching, judging, waiting. "You can't escape," the voice echoed from every direction. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else. Something beyond it. "You never could." I screamed. The sound echoed, but it was wrong. It sounded distorted, as though my own voice was coming from a place that wasn't my own. The air itself seemed to twist and bend around me. I tried again, begged for the world to shift back, for the mirror to release me. But the shadows, the reflection, began to close in. It was winning, and I was powerless. But then, something changed. Something inside me broke. With a force I didn't understand, I pushed back. I wasn't going to let this thing take over. I wasn't just a reflection. I wasn't just a shadow in its world. I had to fight back. I had to prove that I was real. And I wasn't going to let it win. I wasn't sure how long I had been standing there, lost in this endless space of shadows and whispers. It felt like hours, or maybe even days, but time didn't work the same way here. The more I tried to focus, the more my mind seemed to slip away, like trying to hold onto a dream as it fades into nothingness. But I wasn't dreaming anymore. I felt the coldness in the air shift again, heavier now, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. It wasn't just the presence of the reflection anymore. It had become something else, something darker, more menacing. The darkness itself seemed to breathe, curling and twisting like a living thing. "You still don't understand," the voice rasped. It came from all around me, no longer just the reflection's hollow mockery, but something far more sinister. The space I was trapped in pulsed with its words, each one a dagger, each syllable a slap against my consciousness. "You were always just a part of me." I shook my head, my body trembling, but I refused to give in. I wasn't just something. I wasn't its shadow, its reflection, its plaything. The thought that I might have been this twisted version all along sent a spike of panic into my chest. I needed to remember who I was. I needed to escape. I forced myself to move, every step heavy, like walking through deep water. The darkness bent around me as I staggered forward, and I couldn't tell which direction I was heading. The ground felt uneven, shifting beneath my feet as if the space itself was changing, warping to keep me from finding any kind of stability. Suddenly, a flicker of light pierced the blackness ahead of me. It was faint at first, but it was enough. Enough to pull me forward. The light grew stronger as I moved closer, its edges jagged and sharp, like broken glass. It felt wrong, too bright for this place. But it was a beacon, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I reached for it, the light now blinding, but I didn't care. I was going to find my way back. I had to. But as I stepped into the light, I heard it, the voice, closer now. It wasn't just speaking to me. It was in my mind, crawling under my skin, poisoning my thoughts. "You can't leave," it whispered. There's nowhere for you to go. This is your home now. My heart lurched, the words like chains binding me in place. But I couldn't stop. I refused to stop. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed forward, the light now a blinding force surrounding me. And then it happened. The light shattered. It wasn't an explosion, not like I'd expected. Instead, it fractured, splintered into thousands of shards, each piece falling into the blackness around me. I heard the sound of glass breaking, sharp and endless, as the space itself seemed to collapse in on itself. I was falling, not just through the air, but through time, through space, through everything I thought I knew. It felt like a dream. No, not a dream. A nightmare. The world around me spun, and I felt myself being torn apart, pulled in every direction at once. The reflection's voice screamed in my ears, but it was fading, growing weaker as the world fractured further. This can't be real. The thought flashed in my mind, the one thing that kept me grounded. If this wasn't real, then I could escape. I had to. The darkness began to crack, the edges of reality fraying, and I pushed, with everything I had, I pushed. I reached out for the one thing I knew was mine, control. Not of the world around me, but of myself. The pull on my body weakened, the shadows loosening their grip. And then, finally, I broke free. I gasped as the light returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the cold, unnatural brightness from before. It was warm, real, like sunlight breaking through a storm. I was back. But something wasn't right. The reflection was gone, but the world around me didn't feel the same. The house, my house, wasn't the same. The walls felt unfamiliar, the air stale and heavy, as if something was still lingering in the corners, waiting for me to turn around. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, like I was suffocating in a reality that wasn't my own. The space around me seemed too still, too quiet. Had I really left? I glanced around the room, the floor still cracked from where the mirror had shattered, the shards of glass still glinting in the dim light. But as I looked closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the floor, just beyond the broken glass, was a reflection. My own reflection. But it wasn't in the glass. It was in the floor itself, in the shadows that danced on the edges of the room. And it was watching me. Have you ever wondered what's buried beneath your feet? It was an innocent question, one that should have lingered as idle curiosity. But as I stood there, staring down into the abyss of the underground chamber, I realized I had just stumbled upon an answer that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The dig had started out like any other. We were in a remote region, known for its forgotten ruins and long-abandoned towns. The locals spoke little of the history, their words coated with a fear I couldn't quite understand. They referred to this land as cursed, a place where strange things happened, where old legends still lurked in the dark corners of forgotten lore. I brushed their warnings aside, thinking of nothing more than the thrill of discovery. I was an archaeologist, driven by a hunger to uncover what time had buried, to bring the past to light, to give meaning to the forgotten. But the deeper we dug, the more I felt something was wrong. It wasn't just the unease in the air or the chilling silence that surrounded our excavation site. It was as if the earth itself didn't want us to find what was hidden beneath. The first sign came when I uncovered the stone slab. It was unusual, unlike anything I had ever seen, carved with symbols that didn't belong to any known civilization. We spent hours trying to decipher the markings, but the more we studied, the more they seemed to move, shifting beneath our gaze as though they were alive. The air turned colder as nightfall approached, and that's when I heard it. A low rumble from beneath, so faint it could have been the wind or something else. I tried to shake off the sense of unease. My colleagues joked about it, calling it superstition, but I could feel something watching us. The excavation continued. We lifted the slab. What lay below was nothing short of an ancient labyrinth of tunnels. I should have turned back then. I should have realized the warning signs for what they were. But curiosity, foolish, reckless curiosity, led me deeper into the labyrinth. The tunnel was narrow, cramped, the walls damp and slick with age. We followed it, our footsteps echoing off the stone like a warning. The further we went, the more the air grew heavy, thick with a suffocating silence that seemed to press against my chest. The light from our torches flickered as if unwilling to stay lit in the oppressive darkness. And that's when I saw it, the first marking on the walls, not just symbols, but scratches. Someone, or something, had been here before. The deeper we ventured, the more we found these markings. Faint, desperate scratches, as though a prisoner had clawed at the stone, trying to escape. The very walls seemed to close in on us, the space narrowing with every step we took. I couldn't help but feel that we were being watched. A cold shiver crept down my spine as I heard the sound of faint whispers, barely audible, but unmistakably there. My colleagues didn't hear them, of course. They continued on, oblivious, their voices growing louder as they joked and laughed, trying to ease the tension. But I knew something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't meant to be here. Then, we found it. In a small chamber deep within the labyrinth. A stone pedestal stood at the center of the room, worn with age but still unmistakably ancient. On it rested a small, weathered book. The pages were yellowed, brittle, as if it had been there for centuries, untouched by time. I opened it. The first page was filled with frantic, scribbled writing, words in a language I couldn't understand. But the further I read, the more I realized that the content wasn't historical. It wasn't a record of the past. It was a warning. The words described an ancient being, a creature that had once roamed these lands, long forgotten by time but never truly gone. It was said to dwell in the darkness, waiting for someone to disturb its slumber. The final entry, scrawled hastily, read, "Do not awaken it. It waits, and it remembers." I felt a chill run down my spine as I closed the book, but it was too late. The ground beneath us trembled. I turned to my colleagues, but they were no longer laughing. They were staring at something in the dark, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. I followed their gaze. In the shadows, something was moving. The ground shook violently. My heart raced, pounding against my chest with an intensity that almost drowned out the distant, unsettling whispers that grew louder, more desperate, from the depths of the earth. For a moment, I thought I was losing my mind, that I had somehow imagined everything, the book, the markings, the whispers, but the trembling beneath my feet told me otherwise. "What the hell was that?" one of my colleagues, Mark, muttered, his voice barely audible over the growing rumble. "I don't know," I replied, my voice steady, but I could feel the panic creeping up my throat. I glanced at the others, Sarah, Luke, and Ben. Their faces were frozen in disbelief, their gazes fixed on the shadows, where the movement had begun. It wasn't just the walls that seemed to shift, the air itself felt thick, like it was alive, pressing on us from all sides. The whispers, they weren't coming from any of us. They came from below, from the very walls of the tunnel, wrapping around us, suffocating the silence. At first, they were faint, unintelligible, but now, they were clearer. Words, sounds, promises. Do not let it find you, the whispers seemed to say. It remembers. Luke stepped back, his face pale, his hand trembling as he pointed to the stone pedestal. It was no longer empty. The book was gone. I blinked, the air around me growing colder with every passing second. I looked back at the pedestal, hoping, praying it was just a trick of the light. But there, in the shadows, where the book had once lain, something moved. Slowly, a shape formed. The air shimmered, as though reality itself was bending. Get out of here. Now! I shouted, fear overtaking my rational mind. But it was too late. From the depths of the stone room, something emerged. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in any conventional sense. It was an entity of darkness, an impossibly tall, gaunt figure wrapped in tattered robes that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow voids, endless black pits that seemed to draw everything into them. The shape, if it could be called that, twisted unnaturally as it moved. It was not just a thing from the past. It was alive, and it was hungry. I stumbled back, my legs failing me as terror clawed at my chest. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind racing for some kind of explanation, some rational thought to hold on to. But none came. The reality before me was far beyond anything I could understand. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. The figure moved toward us, its footsteps heavy, each one sending vibrations through the earth that rattled my teeth. Run! Ben screamed. But we were frozen. None of us could move. The shadows reached out for us, a coldness that seemed to seep into our bones. Luke, who had always been the most level-headed of us, turned to face the creature, his face twisted in terror. We need to get out, now! His voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw something I had never imagined, fear. True fear. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, the room was silent. Too silent. The whispers had stopped, the tremors had ceased. The creature, the thing, was gone. But it didn't matter. Its presence lingered, a weight on my soul that I couldn't shake. The others were there, scattered on the cold stone floor, just as disoriented as I was. Is it gone? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked around frantically, her eyes wide, scanning the room as if expecting the creature to appear at any moment. I didn't answer. I couldn't. What could I say? That we were being hunted by something ancient, something that had been waiting in the darkness for centuries? It was impossible. But it was also the only truth I knew. We had to leave. I knew that. But every instinct screamed at me to stay. The fear, the terror, they were pulling me deeper into the labyrinth, into whatever nightmare had been unleashed. Let's move, I said, trying to sound calm, though I could feel my legs trembling beneath me. We need to get out of here, now! But the path back wasn't the same. The tunnels that had once seemed like a maze now felt like a living thing, twisting and warping around us. The walls seemed to close in, and the deeper we went, the more distorted reality became. The air was heavier, more oppressive. And the silence, it was deafening. And then, we heard it. A soft scrape against the stone. A shift. A movement. Slowly, surely, the thing was following us. I turned to face my team. Move faster. My voice cracked. The terror in my chest had taken over, and all I could think about was escaping from whatever was stalking us in the dark. But it was already too late. We ran. The sound of our hurried footsteps echoed in the narrow, twisting tunnels, but no matter how fast we moved, the air felt like it was closing in on us. The whispers had returned, but now they were louder, almost too loud, like a chorus of voices swirling in the dark, each one a cold breath against my skin. I turned my head briefly, my heart hammering in my chest. There, in the shadows, I saw it again. The shape. The thing. It was moving toward us, its form barely visible in the gloom, but unmistakable in its unnatural movement. It didn't walk, it shifted, as if the very laws of nature couldn't hold it together. Each step was a ripple in reality, like the air itself buckled under its weight. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop. We couldn't stop. Faster. I heard Mark yell, but his voice was strained, desperate. He was ahead of the group, his steps frantic as he tried to push forward, away from the terror that trailed us. Behind me, Sarah was breathing heavily, her voice ragged. It's getting closer. Her words were a guttural rasp, filled with the raw panic that we all felt. But even as she spoke, I heard it, another step. Another scrape of something dragging across the stone. And then, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. Not a human sound. Not even an animal. I had no doubt that whatever that thing was, it was hunting us. The tunnel ahead was narrowing, and I could feel the walls pressing in. The walls, they were changing. They had started to sweat, beads of moisture gathering in the dim torchlight, as though the stone itself was alive, reacting to our fear. The temperature dropped rapidly, the cold seeping into my very bones, until I could see my breath in the air. We're not going to make it. Ben screamed, his voice breaking. His words were frantic, laced with the kind of terror that makes people lose their grip on reality. He turned to face the others, his eyes wide with panic. We need to split up. No! I shouted, my voice hoarse. That'll only make it worse. Stick together. But before I could stop them, Ben and Mark had already darted off in different directions. The sound of their footsteps quickly vanished, swallowed by the darkness. No! Stay together. I called again, but it was too late. They were gone. The tunnel was too quiet now. The sound of the others was lost, and I could only hear my own breath, harsh and frantic. It was as though time had stopped. The light from our torches flickered again, casting strange, erratic shadows on the walls. And the whispers, they were all around me. Pressing in. Taunting. It remembers. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the labyrinth. It was Ben. I didn't need to see him to know. The sound was too close, too sharp. He had fallen. But when I turned to run toward the sound, my body locked in fear. There, in the gloom, something moved. Something large, too large to be human. It stepped into the weak light of my torch, and my stomach turned. It wasn't the same creature I had seen earlier. No, this was worse. It was massive, so tall that it seemed to bend the very air around it, its body twisted and deformed. Where its head should have been, there was nothing but a hollow, gaping void. The darkness within it seemed to pull at everything, like a black hole. And its skin, if it could even be called that, was a shifting mass of dark, rotting matter. It was as though the very concept of a living being was fighting to hold itself together. It made no sound at first. It just stood there, looming, watching. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The creature raised a hand, long, spindly fingers stretching out from the dark, reaching toward me. The air around it warped, twisting with a nauseating heat that made my stomach churn. It seemed to grow larger with every passing second, its presence expanding until it felt like the entire tunnel was consumed by its shadow. Then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a voice at all. It was the grinding of stone, the sound of something ancient and incomprehensible trying to reach into my mind. A low, guttural hum that vibrated in my skull, a whisper too terrible to understand. You awakened me. I didn't wait to hear more. My legs finally responded, pumping beneath me as I turned and ran, sprinting as fast as I could, not daring to look back. Every part of me screamed to escape. I had to get out of this place. I had to escape the thing that had been waiting for centuries. But the way out wasn't there anymore. The tunnel had changed. What had been an open path just moments ago was now a maze of twisting corridors, each one a mirror of the last. I turned down one, then another, but no matter where I went, I was lost. The walls seemed to shift as I moved, the floor uneven, as though the earth itself was playing tricks on me. And all the while, the whispers followed. The growls, the scratching sounds, and the feeling of being watched, always watched. I rounded a corner and froze. Mark. His body was sprawled on the ground. His eyes were wide open, but there was no life in them. His mouth hung open in a silent scream. His chest, it was caved in, as though something had torn through him from the inside. Blood pooled around him, dark and thick, staining the stone floor. And standing above him, the creature. It looked at me, its hollow eyes locking with mine. And in that moment, I knew. It wasn't done with me yet. I couldn't breathe. Mark's body lay still in front of me, the dark blood pooling around him like a terrible omen. His eyes, those eyes that had once been full of curiosity and life, now stared into nothingness. It was as though the creature had taken every ounce of him, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell. I took one trembling step back, and the air around me thickened. The whispers were louder now, growing in volume, like a cacophony of voices gnawing at my sanity. Every word that slipped through the darkness sounded like a threat, a promise of what was to come. The creature, the thing that had been waiting, turned its head, its movements so unnatural that I thought the world itself would collapse under the weight of its presence. The shadows clung to it, twisting and distorting with every movement, as if they couldn't escape its grasp. And yet, despite all its horror, there was something almost familiar about it. You should have never come here, it said. Its voice, if you could even call it a voice, was like an earthquake in my mind, a roar that tore through every thought, every instinct I had. I wanted to run. My legs burned, every fiber of my being screamed to flee. But my feet were rooted to the ground. My body refused to listen to me. The terror was so overwhelming, so suffocating, that I could feel it creeping into my bones, freezing me in place. I managed to lift my head, my eyes locking with the void where the creature's face should have been. And then, for the first time, I saw it, a flash of something. A glimpse, just a flicker, but enough to send a chill down my spine. Behind the darkness, beyond the void, there was something else. Something human. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew. There was someone, or something, trapped in there, imprisoned in the blackness, struggling to get out. Please, the word was barely a whisper, but I heard it. It was human. The voice was raw, desperate, like someone who had been screaming for eternity. Help me. I gasped, stumbling backward, my breath caught in my throat. What was this thing? What had it been? And what was it doing to those who had come before? But before I could think, before I could act, it moved again. This time, faster than I could comprehend. Its spindly fingers shot out, wrapping around my wrist with the force of a vice. The pressure was suffocating, and a cold wave of pain surged through my body as I tried to pull away. The creature's grip tightened. It leaned closer, its presence crushing, suffocating. You awoke me. And now, you will become part of me. The words echoed in my mind, filling every corner with its horrifying promise. I could feel its cold breath against my skin, a chill that sunk into my flesh and froze my blood. The room around me seemed to distort, the walls closing in tighter, as if the tunnel itself was swallowing me whole. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I had to fight. I had to do something. I swung my free arm wildly, my fingers grazing the ground. My hand brushed against something hard, a jagged piece of stone, sharp and rough. I seized it, the weight of it grounding me for a moment, and with every ounce of strength I had left, I slammed it into the creature's arm. It let out a guttural scream, but the pain didn't last. The creature barely flinched as I struck it again and again. It was like hitting a wall. The more I fought, the more I realized it didn't matter. No matter how much I struggled, it was inevitable. The creature was far stronger than I could ever be. And then, I saw it. In the darkness, in the shifting shadows, there was a figure. A person. A man, no, a corpse. His skin was pale, stretched thin over bones, and his eyes were wide open, empty. But there was something in his gaze, something that made me freeze. He was looking at me. His mouth moved, but no sound came from him. I couldn't hear his words, but I could feel them. A sense of dread washed over me, and I realized he knew what was happening. He had been through this. And now, he was trapped here, just like I was. The creature tightened its grip, pulling me toward the darkness, pulling me closer to the body. I could feel the coldness radiating from it. It was alive in some twisted, horrifying way. It had been waiting, just like the creature, waiting for someone to come to disturb its prison. And in that moment, I understood. The creature didn't just hunt us. It became us. I couldn't scream. I couldn't fight. I was slipping away, my body being dragged into the void, into the endless blackness. But before I lost consciousness, I caught one last glimpse of the man's eyes. And in them, I saw my own reflection. The air was thick with silence. The kind of silence that felt oppressive, like the world itself had been muffled. My head throbbed. My body screamed in pain. My fingers twitched, the only reminder that I was still alive. But where was I? I blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a brief moment, I thought I was still stuck in that dark tunnel, trapped by the creature's grasp. But the air around me was different, fresher, lighter. I wasn't suffocating anymore. Yet something was wrong. I forced myself to sit up, my vision blurry at first. The surroundings were unfamiliar, smooth stone walls, strange symbols carved into the surfaces, and a low hum that vibrated through the ground beneath me. I touched the floor, instinctively pulling my hand back as a wave of ice-cold fear shot up my spine. The room was too clean, too sterile, too new. I stood up, my legs shaking, the floor feeling like it might give way beneath me. I had to get out. I had to find my way back. But something tugged at me, something deep inside. A whisper. A faint voice that only I could hear. You can't leave. The voice was so soft, so quiet, like it was coming from the very walls themselves. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I looked around, but there was no one here. Except for the presence. It was suffocating. It was everywhere. I could feel it closing in, wrapping around me like a spider's web. There was no escape. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, echoing through the corridors. I turned, but saw nothing. The footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My heart pounded, my pulse quickened. It was coming for me. I backed up against the wall, my breath shallow. It was out there. I could feel its presence in the air, like it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The footsteps stopped. I didn't dare breathe. You shouldn't have come. The voice was clear now. Louder. It wasn't in the walls anymore. It was inside my head. A deep, guttural whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I could feel the walls closing in on me. The air grew thicker, suffocating. There was no escape. I was trapped. I looked down at my hands, and the horror set in. They were covered in blood. It was all over me, dripping down my arms, staining my clothes. But I hadn't seen any blood. Not until now. I wiped my face, my skin cold to the touch, but when I pulled my hand away, it was stained red. It was the same blood that had pooled around Mark. The same blood that had spilled from his body. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The creature hadn't let me go. I had never left. I wasn't in some new place. I was still underground, still in the clutches of whatever that thing was. And it had dragged me deeper. Deeper than I ever wanted to go. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath me. The lights above flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, like they were alive. I stumbled backward, tripping over something on the ground. I fell hard, the stone floor scraping against my skin. When I looked up, I saw them. Figures. Emerging from the shadows, they were tall and thin, their bodies barely discernible in the dim light. They were like the thing, the creature, but somehow different. These were not just shadows. These were bodies. Souls. Prisoners. I recognized one of them. It was Mark. His lifeless eyes stared at me, empty and devoid of everything that made him human. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Behind him, there were others. People I didn't know. Faces I didn't recognize. All staring at me with the same hollow, desperate gaze. They were all trapped. Trapped like I was. Help me. The whisper came again, this time clearer, more frantic. It was Mark. He was pleading with me, reaching out with his hand. His voice had become strained, desperate, like he had been calling for help for years. I felt the urge to go to him, but I couldn't. Something held me back. The fear. The coldness. The realization that no one could escape this place. The ground shook again, and the creature's presence grew heavier, its oppressive energy seeping into every corner of the chamber. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see it. It was watching, waiting. I had to leave, but there was no way out. "You're one of us now," the voice echoed, not in my ears, but inside my mind. I knew it was the creature, its terrible grip tightening around my thoughts. It had been waiting for me, just like it had waited for Mark. And now, it had me. I backed away, shaking, my mind unraveling. There was no escape. No way out. The creature had won. And now, I was part of it. What if the things you thought you knew about the world were nothing but illusions, and the truth was hidden in the shadows? I didn't believe in the supernatural, not until the shadows started moving on their own. I had always been the rational one, the skeptic. A quiet office, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and my constant search for answers, these were the things I could trust. No ghosts, no spirits, no creeping entities. Just the mundane. But now, even as I sit in this sterile, lifeless room, there's something different. It started with a flicker. At first, I thought it was nothing. Maybe just a trick of the light. But then it happened again. And again. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to bend, twist, and elongate. It wasn't just the lighting, it was something else, something unnatural. I tried to focus on my work, forcing myself to ignore the creeping sensation that something was watching me. But my eyes kept drifting back to the corner, to the movement. Was it my mind playing tricks on me? I leaned forward, my breath catching in my throat as I watched the shadow grow, stretch, and shift as if it were trying to escape its own form. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to shake the feeling that the room had suddenly become far too small. The shadows felt like they were closing in on me. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just an illusion. This was real. And I couldn't understand it. A noise echoed from the hallway, distant yet sharp, pulling me back into the present. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath. "It's just shadows." But even as I tried to rationalize the growing fear, a chill ran through me. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, heavier. The flickering shadows weren't just moving, they were getting closer, like they were drawn to me, circling, waiting. I glanced around, looking for something, anything to explain what was happening. The walls, the door, the windows, they all seemed so normal, so safe. But the shadows, they didn't belong. And the more I watched, the more it seemed as though they were watching me, too. I walked toward the door, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. I reached for the handle. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, but before I could turn it, I froze. The shadows, they had multiplied. There were more of them now. And they weren't hiding in corners anymore. They were creeping along the walls, twisting around the furniture, pooling in the center of the room like they were alive. Am I losing it? I whispered aloud, hoping the answer would somehow ease my mind. But there was no answer. Only silence. And the shadows, growing darker, more tangible, more real. I backed away slowly, but they followed. They stretched across the floor, their forms shifting, coalescing into shapes too strange to comprehend. My heart raced. I couldn't breathe. And then I heard it. A low, grinding sound. A whisper. Not from anywhere in the room, but from within the shadows themselves. It was as though the darkness had a voice, and it was calling to me. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but I knew I had to get out. I turned, my pulse thundering in my ears, and bolted toward the door. But just as I reached for the handle, I felt it, a cold, invisible weight, like hands wrapping around my chest, holding me in place. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room felt smaller now. And those shadows, they were no longer just part of the room. They were part of me. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. It could have been seconds, it could have been hours. Everything was still, unnervingly still. The shadows were gone, but I could still feel them. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in my mind, trying to bring some sense of reality back. The room was the same as it had been moments before. Nothing had moved, nothing had changed. But something had. Something had shifted. It was in the air, thick and suffocating. A feeling I couldn't shake. I stood slowly, my legs trembling beneath me as I made my way to the door. The floor creaked underfoot, the sound sharp in the silence. I had to leave, had to escape whatever it was that had taken hold of me in that room. The hallway outside was just as silent, the usual hum of the office absent, like the entire building had been emptied. It was strange, almost unsettling. I looked down the hallway, but no one was there. Not a single soul. I rubbed my eyes, trying to get a grip, but the image of those moving shadows, the way they had stretched and twisted, haunted me. It was too real. Too vivid. Too unnatural. I started walking, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. What had I seen? What had happened to me in that room? The logical part of me wanted to dismiss it, wanted to believe that it had been some kind of strange episode, a trick of the mind. But the deeper, darker part of me knew better. Something was wrong. Something had been awakened. I reached the staircase that led down to the lower floors of the building, the echo of my footsteps sounding far too loud in the emptiness. I hesitated, staring at the darkened steps. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to escape. But there was no way to run from something I couldn't understand. I took the first step. The darkness below felt colder, the air heavier, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I took another step, then another, descending into the silence that seemed to stretch farther than I'd ever noticed before. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. The door to the old storage room, one that no one had used for years, was slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before, and yet now, it seemed to call to me like it was waiting for me to open it. Something pulled me toward it. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking as it moved. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, the faintest sliver of light filtering in from the hallway. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy, untouched for years. The smell of old paper, mold, and something else, something foul. The floor was littered with boxes and forgotten artifacts, but what caught my attention was the corner of the room. There, half hidden behind a stack of old crates, was a table. And on that table, there was a book. A heavy, ancient-looking book. It wasn't just any book, though. As I drew closer, the words on the cover seemed to shift, to change, as if they were alive. They weren't in any language I recognized, but they felt familiar. They felt wrong. I could feel the weight of the book, pulling me in, calling me closer. My fingers trembled as I reached out to touch it, but before I could, the air around me shifted. The temperature dropped, and the faintest whisper echoed through the room. I turned, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the shadows. They were back. But this time, they were different. This time, they were everywhere, curling around the room like living things, waiting. I grabbed the book, my hand shaking, and in that instant, the whisper turned into a voice. A low, guttural sound that echoed from every corner of the room. Leave. I stumbled back, the book slipping from my hands and crashing to the floor with a sickening thud. The shadows surged forward, swirling around me like a storm, their forms twisting into something more. And then, I saw it. In the dark, in the corners of my vision, I could make out the shape, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its face was shadowed, a blur of features, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and predatory. It was the thing from the book. And it was coming for me. I turned and ran, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder, their shapes getting closer. I had to escape. But how? I didn't know. I only knew one thing. I wasn't alone anymore. I couldn't stop running. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted down the narrow hallway, the sound of my breath ragged and sharp, but there was something else, something behind me. The faintest whisper of movement, the brush of air as if the shadows themselves were following, pursuing. I didn't dare look back. The building, once familiar and mundane, had become a labyrinth of nightmares. The lights flickered above me, casting quick, erratic flashes of illumination, making the shadows stretch and twist into unnatural shapes. Each time the lights blinked, the world around me seemed to warp. The hallway behind me seemed longer, darker, as though it was growing to swallow me whole. I had to get out. I had to leave before whatever had followed me could catch up. I reached the door to the main stairwell, my hand fumbling as I tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't turn. I yanked at it again, panic rising in my chest. The door wouldn't budge. There was no escape. The whispering voices from the shadows were growing louder now. I could feel them surrounding me, closing in from all sides, pressing in from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. I could almost hear their hunger, their thirst for something, me. Suddenly, the air turned cold. The temperature dropped so quickly that my breath came out in invisible puffs, like smoke. The shadows weren't just moving now. They were forming into something, into someone. A figure, tall and gaunt, its outline becoming clearer with every second, the shape emerging from the darkness. I couldn't breathe. The figure's face remained hidden, but I could feel its presence, dark, suffocating. Its eyes, though they were hidden in shadow, felt like they were boring into me, judging me. The silence in the hall was deafening, and yet the whispers filled my ears. I could hear them now, distorted voices, guttural and unintelligible, but each word was like a heavy weight on my chest. Leave now, or stay forever. I staggered backward, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned to the stairwell again, but the door was no longer there. In its place stood only the wall, cold and unyielding. The figure stepped closer, its movements so smooth, so fluid, that it seemed to glide rather than walk. It didn't make a sound, no footsteps, no breath, just the eerie rustle of something impossibly dark, like the space around it was warping with every step. I backed into a corner, my mind racing for any way out. There had to be a way. A door, a window, anything. But the walls felt like they were closing in. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, as if they were coming from inside my own head now. I felt them crawling over my skin, burrowing into my thoughts. I shut my eyes, trying to focus, trying to breathe, but the pressure in my chest only grew worse. The thing, the figure, was so close now. I could feel its presence like a weight on my soul. Why? I gasped, the words slipping out of my mouth before I could stop them. The figure didn't speak, but I felt its answer, sharp and cold, deep within me. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was a part of the shadows themselves, a manifestation of something ancient and malevolent. It was the thing that had been waiting, biding its time in the dark corners of the world, waiting for someone to uncover it. And now, it had found me. I felt a pull, a sudden, overwhelming force dragging me toward the figure. My body moved without my consent, my feet stumbling forward as if the shadows themselves were reaching out to claim me. No, I whispered, shaking my head. But the force was stronger than my will, stronger than anything I could fight against. My vision blurred, and the whispers became screams, the words now clear in my mind. Stay with us, forever. And then, before I could scream, the darkness consumed me. The last thing I felt was the cold fingers of the shadows wrapping around my throat, pulling me into the void. I woke up with a start. My breath came in short gasps, my chest rising and falling rapidly as I shot upright. I was no longer in the hallway, no longer near the shadows or the figure that had almost consumed me. But where was I? The air around me was thick, too thick. It pressed down on me like a physical weight, as though I were underwater. The faintest light flickered ahead, a pale, sickly glow that barely illuminated the space around me. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, sluggish. My limbs were stiff, my vision blurry, as if I were seeing through a fogged-up glass. I tried to call out, but no sound escaped my throat. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, a deafening rhythm in the silence of this place. The walls, if that's what they were black, jagged, and slick. There was no floor, no ceiling, just an endless expanse of inky darkness stretching in all directions. The glow seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, as if it were alive, feeding off my fear, drawing closer with each beat. Where was I? I tried to take a step, but my foot sank into the ground, as if the very floor was made of thick tar, gripping my ankle with an icy, suffocating hold. Panic surged through me again, but I couldn't move, couldn't escape. Then, I saw it. A shape, at first indistinct, shifting in the shadows just beyond the reach of the pale light. It was tall, far too tall, and its form was fluid, like smoke swirling in the air. The figure was shifting, twisting, becoming something else entirely with each passing moment, its shape barely recognizable. It wasn't the same thing as before, but the sensation of dread, of something watching, was the same. I could feel it. The whispers returned, louder now. They echoed around me, seeping into my mind, filling the empty space. The voices were different this time, deeper, more menacing, like 1,000 breaths, all exhaling in unison. Did you think you could escape? The voices crooned. There is no escaping the shadow. I tried to scream, but still nothing came. My throat felt raw, dry. I reached out, my hand trembling, and I could feel the walls around me begin to shift, as if the very space was alive, bending and twisting in response to my panic. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, oppressive. Every movement I made was sluggish, like moving through syrup. The whispers grew louder, until they became a deafening roar in my mind. The light flickered again, and the figure, whatever it was, seemed to grow taller, looming closer. Its form became more defined, the outline of a face appearing in the dark void. Its eyes were dark, endless pits, and they stared straight through me, pulling at the very core of my being. I could feel its presence, its hunger. It wasn't just watching me, it was waiting. waiting for something. Stay, stay forever, the voice whispered again, and I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. I fought against the oppressive air, my body screaming for escape, but I couldn't move. The figure stepped closer, its shape now almost human, but there was nothing human about it. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it wasn't meant to exist in this world at all. Did you think you could control your fate? It hissed, its voice like sandpaper scraping against my skin. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But there was no fight left in me. There was only fear and the undeniable certainty that I had made a terrible mistake. The figure reached out with a long, clawed hand, its fingers curling toward me. And then I realized the truth, the thing that had been waiting all this time. It wasn't just following me. It had always been here, lurking, just outside the edge of my perception, waiting for someone to open the door. And now that door had been opened, and I was its prisoner. I reached for the shadows, instinctively. Maybe there was some way to fight it, to get away. Maybe if I held onto the darkness, I could pull myself out of this hell. But the shadows slipped through my fingers like sand, slipping further and further away. Stay. The figure's voice was almost a plea now, as if it needed me to stay. We are one now. I tried to turn away, tried to break free, but the shadows closed in on me from every direction, pulling me deeper into their embrace. I couldn't fight anymore. I couldn't breathe. The darkness surrounded me, suffocating, and for the first time, I let it. The last thing I felt was the cold touch of its fingers on my arm, and then everything went silent. I woke up again, not with the sudden gasp of panic I had felt before, not with the bone-deep chill of something unnatural closing in. No, this time, I woke as though I had been lying there, suspended in time, waiting for something. The oppressive weight on my chest had lifted, but something still lingered. It was a sense of hollow quiet, the kind you can only find in places where no one has dared to tread. The air was different now, stale and metallic, like the smell of old rust clinging to everything. I opened my eyes slowly, but my vision remained blurry, unfocused. I blinked several times, forcing my senses to sharpen, to make sense of where I was. But the room, if it could be called that, was empty. Empty and vast, stretching in all directions. The walls, if there even were walls, were made of stone, ancient and cracked, their surface worn smooth by centuries of neglect. They seemed to be alive, shifting subtly, as though they could grow and change at will. I slowly raised my hand to my face, feeling the cold sweat coating my skin. My pulse thudded heavily in my ears. For a moment, I thought I had been dreaming, that this was some elaborate nightmare I had created in my mind. But the smell, the taste of fear in the air, told me otherwise. And then, I heard it. A sound so faint, I thought I might have imagined it. A soft scraping. A shift in the air, a whisper carried by the wind. I tensed, heart racing again, and turned my head toward the source. I should have known. The shadows never truly left. I stood up shakily, the cold stone beneath my feet as unyielding as the walls around me. The scraping grew louder, more pronounced. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, the same presence from before, hovering at the edges of my awareness. I knew it was watching, waiting. The voice, too, still echoed faintly in my mind, the words like claws scraping against my thoughts. Stay with us. We are one. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog, but the voice only grew louder, more insistent. You cannot escape. You opened the door. You belong to us now. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting around the room, seeking an escape, but there was none. No doors, no windows, just the endless expanse of stone. The shadows writhed in the corners of my vision, twisting and turning, waiting for the moment when they would consume me completely. There had to be a way out. There had to be something I could do. I backed up further, the room feeling like it was closing in on me. Each step I took was met with a louder scrape, a louder whisper. The shadows swirled, forming shapes that danced just beyond my reach. One shape, in particular, seemed to stand out, a figure, too tall, too thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but I could feel its gaze, cold and judgmental, seeping into my skin. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, as if something invisible were constricting my lungs. I could hear my heartbeat in my throat, a desperate drumbeat that seemed to be driving me mad. It was always going to be this way. The figure stepped forward, its movements too fluid, too strange. Its body was nothing like anything human. Its limbs twisted at odd angles, shifting with an unnatural grace, and for a moment it almost felt as if the very air around it bent to its will. And then, its face, a face that had been hidden in the shadows, came into view. It wasn't a face at all. At least, not in the way I understood faces. There were no eyes, no mouth, just an endless, shifting surface that seemed to ripple like water. The shape of it was wrong, too soft, too empty. It was as if the thing had no substance at all, yet I could feel it in every fiber of my being, its presence so intense it was like a weight pressing on my chest. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My legs gave way beneath me, and I crumpled to the floor. The shadows closed in around me, their whispers now a roar, deafening, overwhelming. And then, in the midst of that madness, I saw something that stopped me cold. There, at the far end of the room, was a door. It was small, hidden in the corner, barely visible, but there it was, a way out. It was almost as if the shadows had let it appear, as if they had given me a chance, a final chance to escape. I didn't think. I ran. My feet slammed against the cold stone, my body moving faster than I ever thought it could. The shadows shrieked behind me, the scraping growing louder, but I couldn't stop. I had to reach the door. The light ahead seemed to grow brighter as I neared, beckoning me with its promise of escape. But when I reached it, I froze. The door was locked. No. No, no, no. I pounded on it with my fists, my breath coming in jagged gasps. But it wouldn't budge. The sound of the shadows, the scraping, the whispers, it all reached a deafening crescendo. They were close. Too close. And then, just as the first tendril of shadow wrapped around my ankle, I heard something that shattered everything. A voice. A real voice, not the twisted whispering from before. Let him go. The shadows recoiled, pulling back, the pressure lifting from my chest. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and for the first time, I saw something different. A figure. It was a man, tall, unshaven, with eyes that were both kind and terrifying in their intensity. His clothes were ragged, his face gaunt, but there was something about him that radiated strength, like he had lived in the darkness longer than I could understand. And then he spoke again. Come with me. And somehow, without understanding how or why, I did. I had never seen the door before. It was right there, in the corner of the hallway, hidden behind a curtain I swore had never been there. And yet, when I reached for the handle, it felt familiar, like I had always known it was there, waiting for me. But it wasn't just the door that caught my attention. It was the silence. The house had always been quiet, but this was different. A heavy, thick silence that seemed to swallow up the usual sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. The air itself felt stifling, as if something was pressing down on me, something unseen, yet so tangible. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand hovering over the doorknob. It didn't make sense. The door was supposed to be here, but I had never noticed it before. I had lived in this house for years. I knew every inch of it. Or at least, I thought I did. Finally, I turned the knob. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. Inside was a room empty, save for a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were bare, the floor covered in dust, as if no one had stepped foot in this place for years. At first, it seemed like just another forgotten room, the kind that people overlook in old houses. But as I stepped inside, I felt it. The air in here was different. It felt colder, heavier, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I turned back to the door to leave, but as I did, I realized something strange. The door was no longer in the same place. It was farther away, as though the room itself had shifted, stretching out in impossible ways. My heart started to race. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. It had to be. But the room was changing. I could feel it. I turned around again, this time more carefully, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of what was happening. Nothing had changed, not at first. The light bulb still hung from the ceiling, the dust still covered the floor. But then I saw it. A small, black object in the corner. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was unmistakable. I walked over to it, feeling an inexplicable pull, as if the object itself was calling to me. It was a small, broken clock, its hands frozen in time. The minute hand was stuck at 3, the hour hand at 12. I bent down to pick it up, and as my fingers brushed against the cold metal, the room seemed to shift again. The walls pressed in, the air thickening around me, suffocating me. My breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding harder than ever. I could feel something behind me, something watching me. I turned, but there was nothing there. The room was still empty, still silent. Then, the whispers started. At first, it was just a faint rustling, like wind blowing through the trees. But soon, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if they were coming from all around me. Low, guttural voices that I couldn't quite understand, but their tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. I backed away from the clock, my mind racing. What was happening? Was I imagining it? Was this some kind of prank? But the fear in my chest told me it was real. This room, this place, nothing about it made sense. And the voices, they were getting closer. I needed to leave. But as I moved toward the door, I noticed something else. The room had changed again. The door was no longer where I had seen it before. It was gone, replaced by a smooth wall of stone, cold to the touch. My panic grew, my breath coming faster now, the whispers drowning out every rational thought in my head. The shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching out from every corner of the room, reaching toward me like dark fingers. My chest tightened with fear as I realized that I wasn't alone. The room had become a living thing, aware of my every move. I ran. I had no plan, no idea where to go, but I had to get out. I slammed my fists against the stone wall, screaming, but there was no answer. The room was swallowing me whole. My heart thudded in my chest as I stumbled back, falling to the floor. And then, for a moment, everything went silent again. The whispers stopped. The shadows froze. But I knew it wasn't over. The silence was just another part of the game. I wasn't sure how much time had passed. My mind was starting to unravel, caught in the disorienting web of this impossible place. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they were all shifting, expanding, contracting. The room was growing. I wasn't sure if I was getting smaller or the room was getting bigger, but I felt trapped. Every corner I turned led to another empty space, yet the air pressed down harder, suffocating me more with each passing second. The silence was no longer comforting. It was oppressive. I needed to find the door. I had to. I stumbled forward again, my hands reaching out, but then I stopped. There, in the center of the room, was something new. Something that hadn't been there before. A chair. A simple wooden chair, its surface worn and chipped. But it wasn't the chair that caught my attention. It was what was in it. A figure. Sitting motionless, its face hidden in the shadows, a presence that felt colder than the room itself. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get away, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my feet stuck to the floor, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure in the chair didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that I had just crossed a line. There was no going back now. I tried to move, to run, to do anything but stand there, paralyzed by the figure in the chair. But my body betrayed me. I was rooted to the spot, my legs trembling, my breath shallow. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing from every direction, bouncing off the walls like 1,000 voices trapped in the same space. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence growing. It was as if the room itself was breathing with it, expanding and contracting like some monstrous lung. The air became thick and heavy, choking me. My mind screamed for clarity, for logic, but all I could do was stand there, trapped in the center of the nightmare. It was then that I noticed something else. The chair, the figure, the shadows. They were changing. The edges of the shadows seemed to stretch further, warping into shapes that weren't there before. At first, I thought I was imagining it, just a trick of the light, but then the shadows took form. Faces. Pale, twisted faces, all staring at me. They didn't have eyes, just hollow, black sockets, empty but filled with something far worse than nothingness. I gasped, stumbling backward, my hands reaching out for something to steady myself, but there was nothing. Only the endless, shifting void that surrounded me. The faces in the shadows began to move, their mouths opening in silent screams, their distorted features contorting in grotesque expressions. I had to get out. I had to escape before. A loud crack split the silence. It was the sound of something breaking. I whipped around, panic flooding my veins. The room seemed to stretch and contract with each heartbeat. I had no idea what was happening anymore. Every wall, every corner seemed to change before my eyes, constantly shifting as if the room itself was alive, twisting and contorting around me. And then, I saw it. The door. It wasn't far from where I stood, but it was different now. The door was no longer just a door, it was a gateway, glowing faintly with an eerie, unnatural light. The wood around the edges was cracked, as if it had been subjected to years of pressure, and it seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. But it was there. And in that moment, it felt like the only way out. I ran. I didn't think, I didn't question, I just ran. Each step I took was like wading through thick mud, my feet sinking deeper with every stride. The shadows reached out, clawing at me, but I ignored them. I had to get to the door. The room was getting bigger. I could feel it stretching, the walls pulling away, the ceiling rising higher and higher, as if it was expanding to swallow me whole. My chest tightened, and I fought to keep my breath steady, but the air was suffocating, each inhale like breathing in shards of glass. When I reached the door, I grabbed the handle. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned it. But it wouldn't open. The door wouldn't move. I pulled harder, panic clawing at my throat. The door was right there. I could see it. I could feel it. But it wouldn't let me out. It was as if the room itself was rejecting me. The whispers grew louder. I could hear them now, speaking in a language I didn't understand, their words like a constant buzz in my mind. The shadows were pressing closer, surrounding me. I was trapped. Trapped in a room that shouldn't exist, with no way out, no escape. I turned back, frantically searching the room for anything that could help. The figure in the chair was still there, motionless, but now the shadows around it had deepened. They seemed to pulse, like the figure was feeding off the darkness itself. And then it moved. Not much, just a slight twitch of its hand. But it was enough to send a shockwave of terror through me. I backed away, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure had been watching me all this time, waiting, and now it was awake. The room was shifting again. The walls were closing in. The door was still there, but it was farther away now, stretching out of reach as the room seemed to grow larger, impossibly larger. I ran again, but this time the room moved with me. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet, pulling me in every direction, like the room was trying to devour me whole. The shadows were closing in, their faces growing more distinct, more vivid. They whispered my name, their voices layered with 1,000 layers of fear. I reached the far wall, but instead of the door, I found nothing. Only smooth, cold stone. I turned around, but the walls had moved again, pushing me further into the center of the room. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't. And then I saw it. A reflection. A mirror standing in the far corner. I hadn't seen it before, but now it was there, tall and dark, reflecting the room in a distorted way, the edges of the glass warped. I approached it cautiously, the whispers in my ears growing louder, more insistent. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. It was wrong. The figure in the chair was there, but in the mirror it was standing. Slowly, it turned its head, its hollow eyes fixing on me. The shadows in the room seemed to crawl along the mirror's surface, reaching out toward me. The figure took a step toward the glass. My heart stopped. I couldn't look away. The mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and twisted, its face now fully visible, pale, hollow, with a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It stepped through the mirror. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room was shrinking, the walls closing in around me, the figure now standing over me, its shadow consuming everything. I was going to die here, trapped in this room with nowhere to run. But as the figure reached for me, something snapped in my mind. My vision blurred, my mind fractured, and I reached out. I grabbed the nearest object, a broken piece of wood from the floor, and swung it wildly, striking the figure. It didn't react. It didn't flinch. But I kept swinging, again and again, my hands trembling, my heart pounding. And then, everything stopped. The room fell silent. The figure was gone. I was alone. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't. The room was still there. It was still alive. And it was waiting for me to make the next move. The silence didn't feel like relief. It felt like a trap. I stood there, panting, the broken piece of wood still gripped in my trembling hands. The room, which had been a chaotic, ever-changing nightmare only moments before, was now eerily still. But I knew better than to trust the calm. It was only a matter of time before the walls began to shift again. I took a step forward, my legs weak beneath me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, to escape. But where could I go? The door had already rejected me, and now there was no clear way out. The room seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the edges blurred and indistinct. I glanced at the mirror. The surface was now perfectly still, the reflection no longer warped. The figure was gone, but the reflection of the room, it wasn't the same. The shadows were deeper, thicker, like they were waiting, watching. And that's when I saw it. A flicker. In the reflection, a door appeared. I froze. The door wasn't there before. I was sure of it. But now, there it was, glowing faintly in the mirror, just like the door I had tried to open earlier. It wasn't the same door, though. This one was different, darker, more ominous, as if it was waiting for me to approach. My breath caught in my throat. It was a chance. A way out. Maybe. But as I took a hesitant step toward it, the room began to shift again. The walls creaked, groaned, and I felt the floor beneath me begin to tilt. The shadows writhed, twisting and curling like living things. The whispers were back, louder now, surrounding me. Their voices seemed to come from everywhere, above, below, behind me. I could hear my name mixed in with the other words, but I couldn't make sense of them. I turned back to the mirror, my gaze fixed on the door. I had no choice. It was my only option. I had to go through it, even though everything in my body screamed against it. The door in the mirror was opening. Slowly. Reluctantly. Like it knew I was watching, and it was waiting for me to make the next move. I took another step forward. And then another. The room seemed to contract around me, suffocating me. My mind raced with fear. Was this real? Was the door actually there, or was it just another illusion, another part of this twisted game the room was playing with me? I didn't know. I couldn't know. But I couldn't stay here. I reached the mirror, my fingers brushing against its cold surface. The reflection in the glass didn't match the world I stood in. It was brighter, cleaner, as if the mirror was showing me something else, something separate from the reality I was trapped in. The door was there, waiting for me. I pushed forward, my hand pressing against the glass. And then I felt it. A force, pulling me in, tugging at my body, dragging me closer to the mirror. It was like the glass was alive, like it was feeding off my fear, my desperation. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. With a deafening crack, the mirror shattered. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The shards of glass exploded outward, and I stumbled backward, my hands desperately reaching for anything to grab onto. But the room was moving again, the floor tilting, the walls pulling away, expanding and contracting like a living organism. The room was no longer just a room. It was a prison, a force that wanted me to stay. I had to get out. I had to. I turned, searching for something, anything, that could give me a way out. And that's when I saw it. The walls. They were different. The once familiar, worn wood was now covered in strange symbols, etched into the surface like some kind of ancient language. They glowed faintly in the darkness, casting an eerie light across the room. The symbols seemed to move, shifting and rearranging themselves, as if they were alive. I tried to focus, but the words didn't make sense. I couldn't understand them, couldn't grasp their meaning. But I knew one thing, they were important. They held the key to whatever this place was. And if I could just figure out what they meant, maybe I could stop it. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched one of the symbols. The moment my fingers made contact, the room shook. The walls vibrated with an unnatural energy, and I stumbled back, my head spinning. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and the shadows began to take shape again. They were coming for me. The figure from the chair. The twisted faces in the dark. They were all coming back. I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time for anything. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to keep moving. The shadows chased me, their cold fingers grazing my skin, their voices echoing in my ears. I could feel the walls closing in, the room shrinking around me with every step. The door, the one I had seen in the reflection, was gone. There was nothing but the darkness. I ran faster, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw something. A flicker of light. A small, distant glow. I reached for it, my hand outstretched, hoping beyond hope that it was real. That it was an escape. But just as my fingers brushed against the light, the room collapsed. Everything went dark. The darkness wasn't empty. It was thick, suffocating, pressing on me from all sides. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, heavy, as though it had become part of the very air around me. The walls were gone, the floor disappeared beneath my feet. There was nothing but an oppressive, consuming void. And yet, I could feel it. The presence. The thing that had been lurking in the shadows, the thing that was always just behind me. It wasn't physical, not in any way I could understand. But I could feel it, inching closer, closer until the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I wasn't alone. I tried to move, to push myself out of this black abyss, but my limbs wouldn't cooperate. Panic surged in my chest, and I was about to scream when, finally, something shifted. Light. Faint, but undeniable. A thin sliver of light cutting through the darkness like a knife. It flickered for a moment, then expanded, spreading out like a pool of molten gold. I didn't know where it came from, but I didn't care. It was something I could see, something I could hold on to. It was my only chance. I forced myself to take a step forward, every inch of movement feeling like it required all of my strength. My legs burned, my muscles screamed, but I pressed on. The light was drawing me in, and with each step, it seemed to grow brighter, more inviting. But the presence was still there. It was always there. I could hear it now, faint whispers creeping at the edges of my hearing. The voices. They had never stopped, but now they were clear, distinct. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to echo from all around me. I tried to block them out, but it was impossible. They filled my head, louder and louder, as if they were inside me, curling into my thoughts, poisoning my mind. The light ahead flickered again, growing dimmer for a second, and then, without warning, it vanished. No. I stopped, frozen. The void returned, colder, darker than before. It was like the air itself was alive now, heavy with a sense of malevolence. The whispers turned to laughter, soft at first, then building, growing into a terrifying chorus of mocking voices. They were taunting me, teasing me, and I knew in that moment, whatever this was, whatever this place had become, it was trying to break me. I couldn't let it. I couldn't let it win. I took another step, then another, stumbling through the darkness. The laughter grew louder, but I refused to turn back. The light had to be out there, somewhere. It had to be. Then, I saw it again. A shadow. It was brief at first, just a flicker, like the movement of something passing too quickly for my eyes to follow. But it was there. And it wasn't alone. Another shadow joined it, and another. Soon, the entire space was filled with writhing, shifting forms, dark shapes that moved like liquid through the dark. They seemed to hover just at the edge of my vision, flickering in and out of existence, their movements erratic, unnatural. I tried to move faster, but the ground beneath me buckled and shifted, as though the very space was twisting. The shadows reached for me, elongating like claws, their fingers stretching toward me, but I couldn't look at them. I couldn't afford to. Every time I glanced at one, it felt like they were drawing me in, pulling me deeper into the void. I had to keep moving. Keep going toward the light. And then, I heard it. A voice. My name. Soft at first, almost a whisper. But it came from somewhere close, too close. I froze, my heart hammering. There was something familiar about it. But it couldn't be real, could it? Get out. The words were clear now, spoken with a sharpness that cut through the haze. I recognized the voice. It was mine. No. I shook my head, my pulse racing. I had to be imagining it. I was alone in this darkness. The only thing left was the mocking laughter, the darkness that wanted to consume me. But still, I heard the voice, clear this time. Get out. You can't stay here. I wasn't sure if I was hearing it inside my head or if it was actually spoken aloud, but the words, they were urgent. Desperate. I forced my legs to move again, though each step felt like it was tearing me apart. The shadows were closing in, and the air was thick with a suffocating heat. I felt like I was walking through mud, each movement dragging me further down. The light reappeared. A faint flicker, distant but unmistakable. This time, I didn't question it. I didn't stop. The shadows followed me, closing in tighter with every passing second. They were no longer just shapes. Now, they had faces, contorted, twisted expressions frozen in agony, mouths stretched open in silent screams. The darkness around me began to pulse, the walls of this forsaken space pushing in closer, trapping me. Get out! The voice screamed again, and I wasn't sure if it was mine or not. I didn't care. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, towards the light. And as I reached it, I felt something change. The ground gave way beneath me. But there was no fall. No crash. No pain. I tumbled forward into nothingness, the light swallowing me whole. I didn't fall. There was no crashing sound. No hard impact. I was weightless, suspended in a void that was as endless as it was silent. Time felt as though it had stopped. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed, if I was even breathing. It was as if the world had been stripped away, leaving only me, alone in this hollow space. I could no longer hear the voices, the laughter, or the darkness. For the first time since this nightmare began, there was nothing. I don't know how long I stayed there. It could have been seconds, or it could have been hours. All sense of time was gone, dissolved into the suffocating quiet. I had no memory of how I got here, or why. And then, the darkness began to return. It wasn't sudden, but I could feel it, just a flicker at first, a shift in the air. It was the same presence I had felt all along, only now it was heavier. Closer. The shadows whispered again, but this time they were no longer taunting me. They were angry. And they weren't alone. I felt something else, something more substantial, moving through the darkness with me. I wasn't alone anymore. The sensation was subtle at first, like the weight of the air shifting around me. But then it grew stronger, sharper. A presence that was cold and oppressive, like fingers wrapping around my chest, squeezing tighter with every passing moment. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath shallow and quick. The room I had once known, the one that had twisted and warped around me, wasn't gone. It had never left. It had only been waiting for me to return. The light, the one that had swallowed me whole, flickered again, but this time it wasn't a guiding beacon. It was a trap. It was a false hope. And I knew, somehow, that if I reached for it again, if I let myself fall back into that light, I would be lost forever. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't an escape. It never was. This wasn't a room that could be left. It wasn't a place I could walk out of. It was a prison. A trap. And I was its prisoner. The shadows shifted again, this time forming shapes. Figures. No longer formless, they had faces. Distorted, twisted faces, all staring at me with hollow eyes. Their mouths moved, but no sound came. The air around me grew thick with their silent screams. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body was frozen, my limbs stiff, as if the very fabric of my being was being bound by invisible chains. I tried to call out, tried to fight, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. I tried to force my limbs to move, to break free of whatever was holding me here, but the shadows were pulling me in. I could feel them wrapping around me, tightening like a noose. There was nowhere to go. No place left to hide. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the far edge of the room. Its form was different from the others. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a face. It was something else, something that didn't belong. It was watching me. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, bathed in a faint, flickering light. But then, it took a step forward. Each movement was deliberate, slow, as if the figure were savoring my fear. I couldn't see its features clearly, but I knew it was real. It was real in a way that the shadows weren't, in a way that the darkness could never be. And it was coming for me. My heart raced, the panic overwhelming me. I tried to scream again, but no sound escaped my mouth. The figure was getting closer, its form growing clearer, more defined with each passing second. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, with limbs that stretched far too long. Its face was obscured in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. It wasn't just watching me. It was studying me. I knew that if it reached me, it would take me. There would be no escaping it, no second chance. I struggled against the unseen force holding me in place, but it was useless. I was trapped. The figure was almost upon me now, just a few feet away, its presence so overwhelming that I could feel it pressing in on me from all sides. I tried to back away, but my body refused to obey. It reached out a hand. Its fingers were long, impossibly long, thin and brittle, like they were made of shadows themselves. They stretched toward me, curling, and I felt a coldness that seeped into my bones, like ice creeping under my skin. Just as its fingers brushed my face, I felt something shift. The room trembled, like it was cracking apart, breaking at the seams. The figure recoiled, its eyes widening in surprise. The darkness seemed to flinch, as if it were alive and afraid. And then there was light. It wasn't warm. It wasn't inviting. It was pure, white light, so bright that I had to squeeze my eyes shut against it. But it burned. It burned like nothing I had ever felt before, like it was tearing through me, ripping apart the very fabric of my being. The figure screamed. It was a sound unlike any I had ever heard. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was a noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the room, vibrating through my bones. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the light vanished. The figure was gone. The room was empty. I was alone. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my chest heaving with each breath. My body shook with the aftershocks of what had just happened, but there was no time to rest. I knew I had to leave. I had to escape before the darkness returned. But as I stood, I saw something on the floor. A piece of paper. I didn't remember it being there before. I bent down and picked it up, my hands trembling. The paper was old, worn, as if it had been here for years. It was a note. And in bold, messy handwriting, it said, "You were never meant to leave." Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.